Nathaniel Cole's hand froze over the cards the moment Silas Pruitt shoved his own wife across the saloon floor like a losing chip. "Take her," Silas spat. "She ain't worth feedin' no more." The room roared with laughter. Nathaniel looked at the woman on her knees, bruised silent, refusing to cry in front of men who'd already decided she was nothing. He stood up, slow, pushed his winnings back across the table, and said the words that would change both their lives forever. "Get up, ma'am. You're coming with me." Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The saloon door slammed open before Nathaniel Cole even reached it, and Silas Pruitt came stumbling out backward, laughing like a man who'd already spent money he didn't have. "Cole, get in here, table's hot tonight." Nathaniel didn't want to play. He'd come to Pine Hollow for flour salt and a new axe head, nothing more. But the wind outside was already turning mean, and a man alone on a mountain needed coin before the passes closed. He sat down across from Silas Pruitt. 3 other men joined the table, a cattle buyer named Odell, a drunk blacksmith called Munson, and a stranger nobody bothered to name. Cards went around. Whiskey went around faster. By the 4th hand, Silas was sweating. By the 6th, he was cursing under his breath. By the 8th, he had nothing left to bet. "Deal me in again," Silas said. "You're out of money," Odell said, not looking up. "I got something better than money." The table went quiet. Munson snorted. "What in God's name you got that's better than money, Pruitt?" Silas turned toward the staircase at the back of the room. "Josephine, get down here." A woman appeared at the top of the stairs. She moved slow, careful, like she'd learned a long time ago that fast movements got noticed, and noticed meant trouble. She wore a gray dress patched twice at the hem. Her hair was pulled back tight enough to hurt. She kept her eyes down. "That's my wife," Silas said, grinning. "Strong as an ox. Cook's cleans don't talk back much. I'll wager her against the pot." The room erupted in laughter. Nathaniel didn't laugh. He watched the woman stop 3 steps from the bottom. He watched her hands folded in front of her knuckles white. "You can't wager your wife, Pruitt," Odell said, still grinning. "She ain't a mule." "She's mine to do with as I please," Silas snapped. "Ain't that right, Josephine?" Josephine said nothing. "Ain't that right?" Silas's voice cracked like a whip. "Yes," she said quietly. The laughter got louder. Nathaniel felt something in his chest go tight and hard like a fist closing around a hot coal. "Deal the hand," Silas said. "Cole's already sittin'. Let's see if the mountain man's got the nerve." Nathaniel looked at his cards. Then he looked at Josephine. She was staring at the floor, but for just a moment, her eyes flicked up just once and met his. There was no pleading in that look, no begging. Just a woman waiting to find out what kind of man he was. Nathaniel set his cards down. "I'm in," he said. The hand played out fast. Silas's hands shook as he laid down his cards, a pair of 8s, nothing more. Nathaniel laid down 3 queens. The table erupted again this time, with hooting and slapping the wood. "Well, Pruitt?" Munson wheezed through his laughter. "Looks like Cole's got himself a wife." Silas's face went red, then white. "Now hold on, that ain't a man can't just—" "You put her on the table," Odell said, standing up and stretching. "You lost. Rules is rules." Silas turned to Josephine like she was the one who'd betrayed him. "This is your fault. You hear me? Your fault." "Don't," Nathaniel said. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Something in the way he said that one word made the whole room go still. Silas swallowed hard. She's yours then. Take her. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway." Nathaniel stood up. He was a big man, built from years of hauling traps and firewood and hide up mountain trails. And when he stood, men noticed. He walked to where Josephine stood at the bottom of the stairs. Up close he could see the fading yellow bruise along her jaw. He could see the way she held her left arm slightly away from her body, like it pained her to move it. "Ma'am," he said, taking off his hat. "Name's Nathaniel Cole. I got a cabin 2 days' ride into the mountains. It ain't much, but it's warm, and nobody there's gonna raise a hand to you." Josephine looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know me," she said. Her voice was low, careful. "You don't know what you just won." "Reckon I know enough," Nathaniel said. "I know you didn't deserve to be sitting on a poker table like a sack of feed." Behind them, Silas laughed bitterly. "Wait till you find out she can't hardly boil water without ruining it. Wait till you find out how much she eats for how little work she does. You'll be begging to trade her back inside a month, Cole." Nathaniel didn't turn around. "Get your coat, ma'am," he said. "We got a long ride, and the weather ain't gonna wait on us." Josephine hesitated. Her eyes moved to Silas, then to the door, then back to Nathaniel. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why what? Why would you do this? You don't know me. I'm not—" She stopped herself. "I'm not worth the trouble people say I am." Nathaniel held her gaze steady. "Ma'am, I've trapped mountain lions that put up less of a fight for their lives than you're putting up right now against a little kindness. Get your coat." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in a wall built brick by brick over years. She went and got a small bag from behind the bar tied with rope and came back down. That was all she owned. Outside, the wind had picked up, cutting sharp across the street. Nathaniel helped her onto the second horse he'd brought, an older mare Gentle used to carrying supplies rather than people, and swung up onto his own. Silas appeared in the saloon doorway, unsteady, pointing a finger. "You'll be back in a week. Cole asking for your money back." Nathaniel didn't answer him. He turned his horse toward the mountains and didn't look back. They rode in silence for the first hour. The town fell away behind them, swallowed by pine and rock and the long gray light of a dying afternoon. Josephine kept glancing at him, like she was waiting for something. A demand, an order, a hand raised. Nothing came. "You ain't gonna say nothin'?" she finally asked. "Didn't figure you wanted to talk," Nathaniel said. "Man learns that much watching how careful you stand." Josephine's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about how I stand." "No, ma'am. Reckon I don't." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "But I know a woman who's been taught to make herself small when I see one. My mother did the same before my pa passed. Ain't hard to spot." Josephine said nothing to that, but her shoulders eased down just slightly, like she'd been carrying a weight in them for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to set part of it down. They rode higher into the mountains as the light failed. The trail narrowed, and the mare stumbled once on loose shale, and Josephine grabbed the horn of the saddle hard enough that her knuckles went white again. "Easy," Nathaniel said, reaching over to steady the mare's bridle. "She knows this trail better than I do. Won't let you fall." "I'm not afraid of falling," Josephine said too fast. Nathaniel glanced at her. "Didn't say you were." She looked away out over the darkening valley below. "I've fallen plenty of times, landed harder than a horse could ever put me down." There was something in the way she said it, flat, worn smooth by repetition, like a stone rubbed round by years of water, that told Nathaniel not to push further. Not yet. They made camp that night in a shallow cave off the trail, one Nathaniel had used a dozen times before. He built a fire while Josephine sat rigid against the rock wall, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You can move closer to the fire," he said. "Ain't gonna bite you." "I'm fine here. Ma'am, it's 20 degrees and droppin'. Pride's gonna freeze the same as anything else." A long pause. Then slowly she shifted closer to the flames. Nathaniel handed her a strip of dried venison from his pack. She took it but didn't eat. "Something wrong with it?" he asked. "No." "Then eat." "I should wait," Josephine said, "until I've done something to earn it." Nathaniel stopped what he was doing. "Ma'am, you rode 2 days into the mountains with a stranger after your own husband sold you at a card table. Reckon that's earned you a meal." "That's not how it works," Josephine said, and for the first time there was an edge of anger in her voice. Not at him, but at something older, something worn into her like a scar. Nothing is free. Everything has a cost. I learned that a long time ago. Who taught you that? Josephine's eyes flicked to him, sharp and sudden, and for a moment Nathaniel thought she might actually answer. Then the wall came back up. Doesn't matter, she said. Eat your food, Mr. Cole. I'll manage. They didn't speak again that night. Get it. The second day of the ride was harder. Steeper trail, colder wind. The first flecks of snow beginning to drift down through the pines. By the time they crested the last ridge, and Nathaniel's cabin came into view, tucked against the mountainside with smoke long since gone cold from its chimney, Josephine's lips had gone pale from the cold. Nathaniel swung down first and helped her off the mare. Her legs nearly buckled 2 days of hard riding, after who knew how long of hard living, but she caught herself before he could reach for her. I'm fine, she said before he could ask. Didn't say you weren't. Inside the cabin was cold and still, exactly as he'd left it a week before. One room, mostly a stone hearth, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a curtain he'd rigged up for privacy that he'd never had reason to use before. You'll take the bed, Nathaniel said, setting down their packs. I'll bunk by the fire. That's not necessary. Ma'am, in this house, what I say is necessary. He said it without heat, but firm enough that Josephine blinked, surprised. Silas would have... She started, then stopped herself. I ain't Silas, Nathaniel said, and you'd do well to stop expectin' me to be. He built up the fire while Josephine stood near the door, arms wrapped around herself, looking at the small cabin like she was trying to memorize every exit. There's a pot for water, Nathaniel said, nodding toward the corner. Stream's 20 yards out back, but it might be froze already this time of year. I'll check on it come mornin'. I can fetch water, Josephine said quickly. I can cook. I can clean. I know how to be useful, Mr. Cole, whatever you need. What I need, Nathaniel said, is for you to sit down and warm yourself before you catch your death. The rest can wait. But Josephine didn't sit. Instead, once Nathaniel stepped outside to see to the horses, she moved through the cabin with quiet, deliberate purpose. By the time he came back and stamping snow off his boots, he stopped in the doorway. The floor had been swept. The table cluttered with tools and empty cans, and the general mess of a man living alone had been cleared and organized. His hunting knives lined up by size, his trap repair tools sorted into neat piles he hadn't even known he owned. A pot of water was already warming over the fire. You did all this in... He looked at the darkening window. Ma'am, I was gone 20 minutes. I told you, Josephine said, not looking up from where she knelt by the hearth. I know how to be useful. Nathaniel walked to the table, running his hand along the neatly arranged tools. This ain't just tidying Josephine. This is somebody who knows tools. Half these I didn't even know I still had, thought I'd lost that all 2 winters back. It was under the bed, Josephine said simply, wrapped in an old shirt. Whoever put it there wanted it kept safe but forgot where they hid it. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. That was me. I know, Josephine said. There was the faintest ghost of something at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but its ancestor. Careless men usually hide things poorly. Nathaniel almost laughed. It caught him off guard, the urge to laugh after so many silent winters alone in this cabin. Careless, am I? You have 4 knives that need sharpening, a trap line that hasn't been properly maintained since first frost, judging by the rust, and you've been eating nothing but salt meat and hardtack for at least 2 weeks, unless I miss my guess. Josephine stood finally looking at him directly. That's not an insult, Mr. Cole. It's an observation. Feels a bit like an insult. Then perhaps you should sharpen your knives, Josephine said, and this time the corner of her mouth did lift just slightly before she caught herself, and looked away, as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. They ate together that night, a thin stew Josephine made from what little he had, but it was better than anything Nathaniel had cooked for himself in months. She still didn't eat until he insisted, and even then she took small portions like she was afraid the food might be taken back. You keep doing that, Nathaniel said. Doing what? Eating like somebody's gonna snatch the bowl away. Josephine's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down. Old habit, she said quietly. From Silas. From before Silas. She stared into the fire. A long time before. Nathaniel wanted to ask. He wanted to ask badly. But something in the tightness of her shoulders, the way her hand had gone still around the spoon, told him this wasn't a door that opened with force. You don't have to tell me, he said instead. Not tonight, not ever if you don't want to. But I'll say this once and then I won't say it again unless you need reminding. Nobody in this cabin is going to take your food or your bed or your say in things. You understand me? Josephine looked at him, and for the first time since the saloon, her eyes were wet. She blinked it back fast, straightened her spine, and nodded once. I understand, she said. Good. Nathaniel went back to his stew like nothing had happened, giving her the mercy of not watching her collect herself. Now eat. You look like a stiff wind could blow you off this mountain, and I didn't drag you 2 days into the wilderness just to have you wither away on me. Something that might have been a laugh, small, rusty, unused, escaped Josephine before she could stop it. Nathaniel pretended not to notice, but inside something in his chest loosened just slightly, like a fist finally unclenching. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Josephine woke before Nathaniel most mornings, the fire already built up by the time he stirred. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended the tears in his coat with stitches so fine, and even Nathaniel found himself staring at them longer than necessary. But it was the small things that started to gnaw at him, details that didn't add up. The way she splinted a rabbit's broken leg, he'd brought back from a trap, setting the bone with practiced, steady hands, before he'd even suggested putting the poor creature out of its misery. Where'd you learn that? He'd asked. Everywhere teaches you something if you're paying attention, Josephine had said, and turned back to her work before he could press further. The way she knew, without being told which of the wild plants near the cabin were good for easing a cough and which would stop bleeding, and which would do a man more harm than good if he wasn't careful. The way her hands, when she thought he wasn't looking, moved with a precision that had nothing to do with farm work or saloon labor. You're not what you say you are, Nathaniel said one evening, nearly 2 weeks in, as she stitched a tear in his glove, with stitches so tiny and even they looked machine-made. Josephine's hands stilled. I don't know what you mean. Silas said you were good for nothing but chores. But I watched you set that rabbit's leg like you'd done it 100 times before. I watched you sort my tools by function I didn't even know they had. Ma'am, I've known plenty of hard-working women in my life, and none of them moved like you do. Perhaps you simply haven't known enough women, Josephine said, but her voice had gone tight, careful. Josephine, don't. The word came out sharp, sudden, more emotion than she'd shown since the saloon. She set down the glove, her hands trembling slightly. Please, don't ask me, not yet. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, the fear in her eyes real and raw, not performance, not manipulation. Whatever she was hiding, it wasn't hiding by choice alone. Something had taught her that the truth was dangerous. All right, he said finally. Not yet, but Josephine. He waited until she looked at him. Whatever it is, whatever you're carrying it, don't change what I see when I look at you. You understand? Josephine's eyes filled again, and this time she didn't blink it back fast enough. A single tear slipped free before she wiped it away, furious with herself. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. You don't know what I've done, what I've lost, what's still out there looking for me. The last words came out before she could stop them, and her face went pale like she'd said far more than she'd meant to. Nathaniel went very still. Somebody's looking for you. Josephine shook her head fast. Forget I said that. Josephine. Please. Her voice cracked. Please, Nathaniel. Not tonight. It was the first time she'd used his given name. Nathaniel let out a slow breath and nodded, though every instinct in him wanted to press further, wanted to know what shadow was following this woman up into his mountains. Not tonight, he agreed. But someday you're gonna have to tell me, whatever it is, because a man can't protect what he don't understand. Josephine looked at him, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. You'd protect me, she asked quietly, even knowing nothing about who I really am. Ma'am, Nathaniel said, I already decided that at a poker table 2 weeks ago. Ain't changed my mind since. That night, after Josephine had gone still and quiet on her side of the curtain, Nathaniel lay awake by the dying fire, staring up at the dark rafters of his cabin. He thought about the way she'd set that rabbit's leg. He thought about the precision in her stitches. He thought about the fear in her voice when she'd said someone was looking for her. Whoever Josephine Carter really was, and he was certain now that wasn't even her true name. Not fully, she was no farm wife, no saloon girl, no burden. Silas Pruitt had been right to discard. She was something else entirely. And somewhere out there in the world, beyond these mountains, somebody wanted to find her badly enough that even now, safe by his fire, she couldn't stop looking over her shoulder. Nathaniel closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling against the shutters, carrying with it the first true howl of the winter storm, rolling down from the peaks and somewhere far below on a trail neither of them could see. A rider moved steadily northward through the dark following directions, bought with silver in a saloon. 2 days' ride from where Josephine Carter now slept, believing for the first time in years that she might actually be safe. She was wrong. Snow fell harder through the night, and by morning it had buried the trail behind them under 6 inches of white silence, the kind of silence that swallowed footprints, that swallowed roads, that swallowed a rider's tracks before they could be followed. The man on the horse below the ridge didn't mind the snow. He'd tracked harder marks through worse weather. He made camp in a hollow beneath an outcropping of rock, built no fire, and chewed jerky in the dark, while he studied the folded paper in his coat pocket. A description written in a careful hand, a name crossed out and rewritten twice, and a number large enough to keep a man patient through a whole winter, if that's what it took. He didn't know yet which cabin. Not exactly. But Pine Hollow was a small town, and small towns loved nothing more than talking about a big man who'd won himself a wife at a poker table 2 weeks back. He'd find it. Men like him always did. Inside the cabin, Josephine woke before first light, same as every morning, and lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to Nathaniel's breathing on the other side of the curtain, slow, even unbothered. She envied that. She hadn't slept a full night through in longer than she could remember. Every sound outside, every creak of settling wood, every gust that rattled the shutters pulled her up out of sleep with her heart hammering and her hand already reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. She rose quietly, pulled her shawl tight, and knelt by the hearth to coax the coals back to life. "You're up early again." Nathaniel's voice came rough with sleep from the other side of the curtain. "Didn't mean to wake you." "Didn't?" A pause, then the sound of him sitting up, boots hitting the floor. "I just don't sleep much past when you start moving around. Old habit, I suppose. Trapper's ears." Josephine fed a piece of kindling into the growing flame. "You could sleep later. I can manage the fire myself." "Ain't about managing." Nathaniel pulled back the curtain, already half-dressed suspenders hanging loose at his sides. "Just like knowing you're all right of a morning, that's all." Something in his voice, plain, unadorned, no demand, hiding underneath it, made Josephine's hand still over the fire for just a moment before she went back to work. "You don't have to worry after me, Mr. Cole." "Nathaniel," he corrected, same as he had a dozen times before. "And I ain't worrying, just noticing." He crossed to the window, looked out at the fresh snow blanketing the yard. "Storm dropped a good deal overnight. Trail down to Pine Hollow's gonna be near impassable for a spell." "Is that bad?" "Depends." Nathaniel reached for his coat. "Means we're running low on flour and coffee for the real winter sets in, and it means whatever needs doing has to get done quick, for the mountain locks us in proper till spring thaw." Josephine's stomach tightened at the word locks, in though she couldn't have said exactly why. Something about permanence. Something about being unable to run if running became necessary. "You look worried." Nathaniel said, watching her over his shoulder. I'm not. Josephine. He said her name the way he always did now, steady, patient, like a man laying down a rope for someone standing at the edge of a ravine. You get a look on your face sometimes, like you're listening for something that ain't there yet but might be any day. She didn't answer right away. She busied herself with the pot, filling it with water from the bucket by the door. It's nothing, she said finally. Didn't ask if it was nothing. Asked if you were worried. Josephine set the pot over the fire, harder than she needed to, and it clanged against the iron hook. Yes. She admitted the word coming out sharper than she intended. I'm worried. I'm always worried, Nathaniel. I don't know how to not be. The confession hung in the cabin air raw and unexpected, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Somebody hurt you bad, Nathaniel said quietly. Not a question. Josephine's throat tightened. Somebody hurt a great many people, she said. I was simply the one who paid for it. She hadn't meant to say that much. She saw it land on Nathaniel's face, the shift, the sharpening of attention, like a hunter catching the first true scent of a trail he'd been circling for days. Paid how? He asked carefully. Josephine shook her head, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders, even though the fire had already begun to warm the room. Not this morning, please. Nathaniel studied her a moment longer, then nodded, letting it go for now. All right. He reached for his hat. I'm gonna check the trap lines before the snow gets deeper. Won't be gone more than a couple hours. Be careful, Josephine said, and then seemed almost surprised at herself for saying it. A small, crooked smile touched the corner of Nathaniel's mouth. Careful's my middle name, ma'am. I doubt that very much, Josephine said, and this time when the corner of her own mouth lifted, she didn't try quite so hard to hide it. Shush. He was gone longer than 2 hours. Long enough that Josephine found herself standing at the window every few minutes, watching the tree line, watching the falling snow. Feeling that old familiar tightness climb up into her chest. The tightness that came from caring what happened to someone and knowing how much it cost when caring went wrong. When he finally came through the door, stamping snow off his boots, she nearly wept with relief before she caught herself. Sorry, Nathaniel said, hanging his coat. Found a fox caught up in one of the deadfalls, tangled something fierce. Took longer to free him without getting bit than I planned. You're hurt, Josephine said, already crossing the room. She'd seen it before he'd even finished the sentence, the way he favored his left hand, the way he'd kept it tucked slightly behind him. It's nothing. Fox got a piece of me before I got him loose. Let me see. Josephine, it's a scratch. Let me see Nathaniel. Something in her tone stopped him cold, a command, not a request delivered with an authority that didn't match the quiet, careful woman who'd spent 2 weeks apologizing for taking up space in his cabin. He held out his hand without further argument. The bite ran along the back of his palm, deep enough to have torn through skin in 2 places already swelling red at the edges. Sit, Josephine said, already moving toward her small bag, the one she'd carried from the saloon. The one Nathaniel had never once asked to look inside. It ain't that bad. Sit down, Nathaniel Cole, or I will sit you down myself. He sat. Josephine's hands moved fast and sure as she worked cleaning the wound with water boiled hot enough to steam, applying something from a small jar in her bag that smelled sharp and medicinal. Wrapping the hand with strips of clean cloth in a pattern too precise, too practiced to have come from simple farm wife know-how. Nathaniel watched her in silence, wincing once when she pressed too firm against the deepest part of the bite. Sorry, Josephine murmured, easing her grip. Animal bites carry rot easier than most wounds. Better to clean it thorough now than lose the hand to fever in a week. You keep saying things like that, Nathaniel said quietly. Like a woman who's watched a hand get lost to fever before. More than once, maybe. Josephine's fingers stilled against the bandage. Finish wrapping it, Nathaniel said gently, not pushing further, though the question still hung heavy between them. We'll talk about the rest when you're ready. You keep saying that, Josephine said, echoing him, her voice barely above a whisper. When you're ready. Nobody's ever given me that before. Time. Room to breathe before answering. Well, Nathaniel flexed his bandaged hand, carefully testing her work. Reckon I'm not most people. No, Josephine agreed softly. I'm beginning to understand that you aren't. 3 days later, the snow eased enough for travel, and Nathaniel announced they'd need to make the trip down to Pine Hollow before the passes closed for good. You don't have to come, he said, hitching the mare to the small sled he used for hauling supplies. I can make the trip alone quick as anything, and you could stay here where it's warm. Josephine, already pulling on her coat, shook her head. I need supplies of my own, cloth for bandages, herbs I haven't been able to find growing wild up here. Nathaniel paused at that, another crack in the wall, another piece of the puzzle sliding into place, but said nothing, only nodded and helped her up onto the sled. The ride into Pine Hollow took most of the morning, the mountain trail treacherous with fresh ice beneath the snow, and by the time the town came into view, Josephine's hands were white-knuckled around the edge of the sled, though whether from cold or nerves, Nathaniel couldn't quite say. You're safe, he said quietly, not looking at her, keeping his eyes on the trail. Whatever's got you wound up tight as a fence wire, you're safe. I got you. Josephine didn't answer, but her grip on the sled loosened just slightly. Pine Hollow hadn't changed much in the 2 weeks since the poker game. Same dusty street, same handful of buildings, same saloon with its swinging doors. But the moment Nathaniel's sled pulled up outside the general store, Josephine felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward her. The whispers started before she'd even climbed down. That's her. That's the Pruitt woman. Heard Cole won her fair and square. Poor fool. Wonder if she's poisoned his coffee yet. Josephine kept her eyes down her spine, straight, moving through the whispers, like she'd learned to move through worse. But Nathaniel stopped dead in the middle of the street, turning slowly toward the small cluster of men who'd gathered outside the feed store. You got something to say? He said. Say it to me, not behind the lady's back. The men fell silent, shuffling, suddenly very interested in their boots. Didn't think so, Nathaniel said, and offered Josephine his arm to walk the rest of the way to the store, an old-fashioned gesture, formal, protective, and Josephine took it with a hand that trembled just slightly. Inside the general store, the owner, a heavy-set man named Barnaby Hicks, greeted them with careful neutrality. Cole, ma'am. His eyes flicked to Josephine and back. Heard you two was making a go of it up the mountain. Just need supplies, Barnaby, Nathaniel said. Flour, coffee salt if you got it, and whatever cloth you can spare. Got cloth in the back. Barnaby hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Say, Cole, there was a fella through here yesterday. Stranger. Asking after a woman matching a certain description. Said he was looking for somebody who used to work back east. Medical trade, he said. Offered good money for information. Josephine's face went absolutely white. Nathaniel felt her hand tighten on his arm hard enough to leave marks. That's so, Nathaniel said, carefully keeping his voice even. What did you tell him? Told him I didn't know nothing about no medical woman, Barnaby said. Which was true far as I knew till just now, watching the lady's face go pale as a sheet. His eyes flicked to Josephine again, more curious than unkind. Something you want to tell me, ma'am? No, Josephine said too fast. No, there's nothing. I don't know what you're talking about. Barnaby studied her a moment longer, then shrugged, letting it go. Suit yourself. Fella said he'd be back through in a few days, headed further into the mountains. Seemed the patient type. Nathaniel guided Josephine toward the back of the store, away from Barnaby's curious eyes, and spoke low and urgent. Josephine, look at me. She was shaking now badly, her breath coming fast and shallow. He found me, she whispered. I thought I'd gone far enough. I thought 2 years was long enough for them to stop looking. Who's looking for you? I can't. Josephine? Nathaniel took her by both shoulders, gentle but firm, forcing her to meet his eyes. I need you to tell me what we're dealing with, right now. Because if there's a man out there hunting you down, I need to know who he is and why, so I can protect you proper. Josephine's eyes filled with tears, and for a long moment, Nathaniel thought she might finally tell him everything. Then the bell over the store's front door jingled, and both of them turned sharply toward the sound. But it was only an old woman coming in for thread, and the moment of near confession slipped away like water through open fingers. "Not here," Josephine whispered. "Please, not here where anyone could hear." Nathaniel nodded slowly, releasing her shoulders. "All right, we'll finish this conversation at home. But Josephine?" He waited until she looked at him again. "Whoever's looking for you, whatever they think you did, I don't believe it. Not for 1 second. You understand me? You don't know what they think I did." Josephine said, her voice breaking. "Don't matter," Nathaniel said simply. "I know you. That's enough for me." They finished their business in town quickly after that, Nathaniel keeping a careful eye on the street the entire time, watching for any stranger who might be watching back. By the time they loaded the sled and started back up the mountain trail, the afternoon light had already begun to fade, throwing long blue shadows across the snow. Josephine stayed silent for most of the ride, wrapped tight in her coat, her eyes fixed on some point far in the distance that Nathaniel couldn't see. "You're gonna tell me eventually," he said, finally breaking the silence as the cabin came into view through the trees. "Might as well be tonight while it's just the two of us and nobody else to overhear." Josephine let out a long, shaking breath. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No, ma'am, I ain't." "You might not want to know," Josephine said quietly. "Once I tell you, you can't unknow it, and it might change how you look at me." Nathaniel pulled the sled to a stop outside the cabin and turned to face her fully. "Josephine, I've looked at plenty of things in my life I wished I hadn't seen. War does that to a man. Losing my folks did that to a man. But I ain't never once regretted knowing the truth, even the ugly parts. What I have regretted is not asking when I had the chance." He held her gaze steady. "So ask yourself this. You gonna keep carrying this alone up here in these mountains, letting it eat you from the inside? Or you gonna let somebody help you carry it for a change?" Josephine's eyes filled with tears again, and this time she didn't fight them. "All right," she whispered. "Tonight. I'll tell you tonight." But that night, before she could speak a single word of her past, the fever took her. It came on fast, faster than Nathaniel had ever seen sickness move on a body, starting with a chill that had her teeth chattering despite the roaring fire, then climbing into a heat that left her skin burning to the touch within the hour. "Josephine," Nathaniel knelt beside the bed, pressing a hand to her forehead, alarmed by how hot she'd gone in such a short span. "Josephine, can you hear me?" Her eyes were open but unfocused, glassy, fixed on something far away that wasn't in the room. "He's bleeding too much," she murmured, her voice thin and distant. "Someone get the clamps. I need more light. I can't see the artery." "Josephine." Nathaniel's voice sharpened with fear. "You're at the cabin. You're safe. There ain't no artery. There ain't no—" "Dr. Ashford, I told you the ligature wouldn't hold." Josephine's hands twitched against the blanket like she was reaching for instruments that weren't there. "I told him. Nobody listened. Nobody ever listens to me." Nathaniel's blood went cold. A doctor's name. Surgical terms falling from her lips like a second language, fluent and precise, even in delirium. "Josephine, wake up." He pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, trying to bring the fever down. "Come back to me, ma'am. Come on now." "They said it was my fault," Josephine whispered, tears leaking from the corners of her closed eyes, even as her body burned with fever. "They said I killed him. I didn't kill him. I tried to save him. I tried so hard, and it still wasn't enough, and now everyone thinks—" She trailed off into incoherent, murmuring words, tumbling together too fast and broken to follow names and places, bleeding into each other. Boston, a hospital ward. A man named Harmon. A courtroom. A judge's gavel. Nathaniel worked through the night, cooling her fever with wet cloths, forcing sips of water past her cracked lips, watching in growing horror and fascination as fragments of a hidden life spilled out of her unguarded mind. Around 3 in the morning, the fever finally began to break, sweat soaking through the blankets as her body fought its way back toward calm. "Nathaniel!" Her voice came weak but lucid, her eyes finding him in the dim firelight. "Right here," he said, relief flooding through him. "You had a fever, something fierce. Scared me half to death." "Did I—" Josephine's eyes went wide with sudden panic. "Did I say anything while I was—" "You said a lot of things," Nathaniel said carefully. "Names. A hospital. Somebody named Harmon. A ligature that wouldn't hold." He watched her face carefully as he spoke, watched the color drain further from already pale skin. "You're a surgeon's assistant, ain't you, Josephine? Or something close to it?" Josephine closed her eyes, defeated, too exhausted from the fever to keep fighting the truth any longer. "I was," she whispered. "Or I thought I was becoming one, before everything fell apart." "Tell me," Nathaniel said gently, settling onto the edge of the bed. "You're too weak to run from it tonight, and I ain't going anywhere. So tell me, Josephine, whatever it is, I promise you whatever comes out of your mouth, I ain't gonna love you any less for it." The word love hung in the air between them, unplanned, unrehearsed, and both of them seemed to hear it at the same moment. Nathaniel's face flushing slightly. Even in the dim light, Josephine's eyes opening wide with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope. Neither of them addressed it directly. Not yet. "I worked in a hospital in Boston," Josephine said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "For nearly 6 years. Started as a nurse's helper when I was 19, cleaning wounds, changing bandages. But I had a gift for it, a memory for how the body worked, for what medicines did, what for how to stitch a wound so clean it barely scarred. Dr. Ashford noticed. He started teaching me things nurses weren't supposed to know. Surgical technique, anatomy, how to read the signs before a patient crashed." "That's remarkable," Nathaniel said softly. "That ain't nothing to be ashamed of, Josephine. That's a gift." "It was," Josephine agreed, her voice cracking. "Until it wasn't." She stopped there, her breath coming faster, the fever's exhaustion and the weight of the memory both pulling at her at once. "You don't have to finish tonight," Nathaniel said, seeing how badly the telling was costing her. "You've said enough for now. Rest first. The rest can come when you're stronger." "You're not going to make me finish?" Josephine asked, surprised. "Ma'am, you just spent an hour burning up with fever and talking about a man dying on an operating table. I ain't cruel enough to squeeze the rest out of you before sunrise." He reached out hesitant and brushed a strand of damp hair away from her face, a gesture so gentle, so careful that Josephine's breath caught in her throat. "Sleep now. We'll finish this conversation when you're ready. Whenever that is." Josephine's eyes filled with tears again. Different tears this time. Not fear, not grief, but something closer to disbelief, that kindness like this could exist, could be offered so freely, without demand or condition. "Thank you," she whispered, and drifted into an exhausted, dreamless sleep before Nathaniel could answer. He sat beside her bed, long after she'd fallen, still watching the firelight flicker across her face, turning over everything he'd learned in his mind. A surgeon's assistant, a man named Harmon who'd died a courtroom, a judge, a stranger in Pine Hollow, asking after a woman with medical training and offering money for information. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, and the shape frightened him. Whatever had happened back in Boston, whatever had driven Josephine 2,000 miles west to end up sold across a poker table, like livestock. It was serious enough that someone was still hunting her, still willing to pay good silver for word of her whereabouts, years after the fact. Nathaniel didn't sleep at all that night. He sat by the fire, his rifle within reach, and listened to the wind howl outside the cabin walls, wondering how much time they had left before whoever was searching for Josephine Carter finally found what and who they were looking for. She was stronger within 2 days. The fever, fully broken color returned to her cheeks, though something had shifted between them in its wake, a closeness neither of them acknowledged aloud. But both of them felt present in every small gesture, every lingering glance. "I want to finish telling you," Josephine said one evening unprompted as she sat mending a torn shirt by the fire. "What I started during the fever. I want you to know the rest." Nathaniel set down the trap he'd been repairing, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." "There was a man," Josephine began, her hands stilling in her lap, the mending forgotten. "A young man, barely 20, brought into the hospital with a wound to his side from a hunting accident. His father was a very important man, a state senator with connections all through Boston society. Dr. Ashford was performing the surgery, and I was assisting as I always did. What happened? The bleeding wouldn't stop," Josephine said, her voice growing distant, pulled back into the memory. Dr. Ashford's hands were shaking. He'd been drinking before the surgery, though nobody was supposed to know that, and I was the only one close enough to see it clearly. I tried to tell him the ligature wasn't holding properly. He wouldn't listen, said a nurse's assistant didn't correct a surgeon's technique. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "So, what'd you do?" "I did what I'd been trained to do," Josephine said. "I stepped in. I corrected the ligature myself without his permission because the boy was bleeding out on the table and there wasn't time to argue about propriety." Her hands began to tremble again. "I saved his life that day, Nathaniel. I want you to understand that first. The boy survived that surgery because I acted when Dr. Ashford couldn't." "That sounds like something to be proud of," Nathaniel said carefully. "Not something to run from." "It should have been," Josephine agreed, tears beginning to slip down her cheeks. "But 3 days later, the boy developed a fever, an infection from the wound, nothing to do with the surgery itself, nothing anyone could have prevented. And he died." The cabin went very quiet. "Dr. Ashford needed someone to blame." Josephine continued, her voice hollow now, worn smooth by however many times she'd told this story to herself in the dark alone. The senator was demanding answers, demanding justice for his son. Dr. Ashford couldn't very well admit he'd been drinking before a surgery on a senator's son. So he told the truth about one thing, that I had corrected his technique without permission, and let everyone draw their own conclusions about what that meant. "He blamed you," Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous. "He said I had exceeded my station, that I had performed surgical corrections I wasn't licensed or trained to perform, and that my interference had led directly to the boy's death." Josephine wiped angrily at her tears. It wasn't true. Any doctor who actually examined the case would have known it wasn't true. But the senator wanted someone to punish, and Dr. Ashford wanted to protect his reputation. And I was a woman with no family, no connections, and no one to speak for me. What happened then? "There was a hearing," Josephine said. "Not a real trial, the hospital board, mostly along with a few men connected to the senator. I tried to explain what really happened. I tried to tell them about the ligature, about Dr. Ashford's hands shaking, about the smell of whiskey on his breath that morning. Nobody believed me. Or perhaps they believed me and simply didn't care, because believing me would have meant destroying a respected surgeon's career to protect the reputation of a woman nobody thought mattered in the first place." Nathaniel's hands had curled into fists without him noticing. "They let him walk free." "They did better than that," Josephine said bitterly. "They praised him for his honesty in coming forward about my supposed overreach. And they told me that if I ever attempted to practice medicine again in any capacity anywhere in the state of Massachusetts, I would be prosecuted for practicing without a license and endangering patients' lives." "That's a lie," Nathaniel said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "That's a goddamn lie, and they knew it." "It didn't matter what was true," Josephine said. "It only mattered what powerful men wanted to be true. The senator's family made sure my name was known throughout Boston, not as someone who'd tried to save his son, but as someone who'd killed him through reckless ambition. I couldn't find work. I couldn't show my face without people spitting at my feet, or worse. So I left. I took what little money I had and I went west, and I told myself I would simply disappear and never let anyone know what I truly was ever again." "And Silas?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "How'd you end up with him?" Josephine let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "I made it as far as Kansas before my money ran out. Silas found me at a boarding house, half-starved, desperate. He offered marriage food shelter, and I was foolish enough, desperate enough to believe that might be safety." Her expression hardened. "It wasn't. He learned quickly that a woman with no family, no name, and a ruined reputation had no one to protect her from him. And I learned that the men who'd destroyed my life in Boston had made me easy prey for every cruel man who came after. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. The picture of the woman before him utterly transformed from the frightened, silent figure he'd won at a poker table 2 weeks earlier. "And the man in Pine Hollow," he said finally, "askin' after a woman with medical training. You think that's connected to Boston?" Josephine's face went pale again. "I don't know for certain, but the senator's family swore they would see me punished properly someday if I ever surfaced again. And offering money for information about a woman matching my description with medical training." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "They want you brought back," Nathaniel said grimly, "to face charges, or worse." "I don't know," Josephine whispered. "I've spent 2 years running Nathaniel. 2 years looking over my shoulder, changing my name, staying quiet, making myself as small and unremarkable as possible, so no one would ever look twice. And now the first time I let myself feel even slightly safe." Her voice broke. "The first time I let myself hope that maybe I'd finally found somewhere I could simply exist without fear." "You have," Nathaniel said firmly, crossing the small distance between them, and kneeling before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Josephine, look at me. You have found that place. This cabin. These mountains. Whatever's comin', whoever's lookin', they're gonna have to go through me first. You understand, I ain't letting anybody drag you back to face punishment for saving a boy's life while a drunk surgeon covered his own tracks." "You can't promise that," Josephine said, though her hands gripped his tightly, desperately. "You don't know what these people are capable of. They have money, influence. They can make things happen that ordinary people can't stop." "Maybe so," Nathaniel agreed. "But ordinary people also don't have a mountain full of hiding places or trap lines rigged along every trail within 10 miles, or a rifle that's put meat on this table through 6 winters without failin' once." His voice softened. "I ain't sayin' it won't be hard, Josephine. I ain't sayin' there ain't danger comin', but I am sayin' you ain't facin' it alone anymore. Not while I'm breathin'." Josephine looked at him for a long, searching moment, and something in her face shifted the last remnants of the wall she'd built brick by brick over 2 years, finally beginning to crumble. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me? You've known me 2 weeks. You could send me back to town tomorrow, wash your hands of all this danger, and no one would blame you." Nathaniel's thumb traced gentle circles against the back of her hand. "Because somewhere in these 2 weeks, Josephine Carter, you stopped being a stranger. I wanted a card table, and you started being somebody I can't imagine this cabin without." His voice dropped lower, rougher with emotion he clearly wasn't accustomed to expressing. "I don't rightly know when it happened. Maybe it was watching you set that rabbit's leg. Maybe it was watching you organize my tools, like you were trying to fix something broken in me too. Or maybe it was just watching you eat that first bowl of stew like you expected somebody to snatch it away and realizing I never wanted to see that look on your face again." Tears streamed freely down Josephine's face now, but for the first time since the poker table, they weren't tears of fear or grief. "I don't know how to trust this," she admitted. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore, let alone—" She stopped herself, embarrassed by how close she'd come to saying something too large too soon. "You don't have to trust it all at once," Nathaniel said gently. "Trust builds slow, same as anything worth having. I ain't in a hurry, Josephine. I just need you to know that whatever's comin', whatever danger's following you up this mountain, I'm staying right here beside you through all of it." The fire popped and crackled in the silence that followed, and outside the wind continued its low, mournful howl through the pines, carrying with it, though neither of them could know it, yet the sound of hoofbeats moving steadily closer through the dark, following a trail of silver-bought information straight toward the mountain cabin, where Josephine Carter had finally foolishly, dangerously begun to believe she might be safe. The days that followed carried a new tension beneath their surface. Not fear exactly, though fear lingered always at the edges now, but something charged and unspoken between Nathaniel and Josephine, a closeness neither of them named, but both of them felt in every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands, passing tools or plates between them. Josephine began teaching him small things about medicine almost without meaning to, pointing out which plants near the cabin held healing properties, explaining why certain wounds needed to breathe while others needed binding tight. "You've got a good memory for this," she told him one afternoon, watching him correctly identify a patch of yarrow growing beneath the snow. "Most men your size think medicine's women's work beneath their notice. Most men my size never watched their mother die of a fever that might have been treated if anybody'd known what herbs to use," Nathaniel said quietly. "Learned early that knowing this stuff ain't weakness. It's survival." Josephine's expression softened. "I'm sorry. About your mother. Long time ago now." Nathaniel shrugged, though something old and sad flickered behind his eyes. "But I reckon that's part of why I never sent you back to town that first night. Something about watching you tend that rabbit's leg reminded me of her. The way she used to work calm and sure, even when things were falling apart around her. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. Nathaniel met Josephine's eyes. "Reckon you remind me of her more with every passing day." The compliment settled between them warm and unexpected, and Josephine found herself smiling a real smile, unguarded the kind she hadn't allowed herself in longer than she could remember. But the peace didn't last. 3 days later, Nathaniel returned from checking his trap lines with his face grim and pale. "Josephine." His voice carried a warning that had her rising from her chair immediately, every instinct sharpening to alertness. "Found tracks. Half a mile out circling the property. Boot prints, not animal. Somebody's been watching this cabin." Josephine's hand flew to her throat. "How long?" "Hard to say for certain. Snow's covered most of it, but I'd guess a day, maybe 2. Nathaniel crossed to the window, checking the tree line with narrowed eyes. "Whoever it is, they're being careful. Staying back at a distance, not coming close enough to be seen from the cabin." "It's him," Josephine whispered. "The man from town. The one asking questions." "Maybe." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Or maybe it's somebody else entirely. Either way, we ain't taking chances." He reached for his rifle, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. "You know how to shoot?" Josephine hesitated, then nodded slowly. "My father taught me before he passed. I haven't held a gun in years, but I remember the basics." "Good." Nathaniel handed her a smaller rifle from the cabinet by the door, one Josephine hadn't noticed before, tucked away, and clean despite apparently never being used. "Keep this close. I don't expect trouble tonight, but I ain't willing to bet your life on expectations." Josephine took the rifle with trembling hands, the weight of it unfamiliar but not entirely foreign muscle memory. From a childhood she rarely allowed herself to think about stirring back to life. "Nathaniel!" Her voice shook. "If it is him, if he finds us, what happens then?" Nathaniel's face went hard protective in a way that sent a shiver down Josephine's spine. Not fear, but something closer to awe at the fierce loyalty radiating off him. "Then he learns real quick." Nathaniel said, "that taking you off this mountain is going to cost him a great deal more than whatever silver he's being paid." That night neither of them slept. They sat together by the fire rifles within reach, listening to every sound the wind carried, every creak of settling snow outside the cabin walls. "Tell me about him," Josephine said quietly, breaking the tense silence sometime past midnight. "Your mother, what she was like before the fever took her." Nathaniel seemed surprised by the request, but after a moment, a small sad smile crossed his face. "She used to sing while she worked. Didn't matter what she was doing, cooking, mending, hauling water, always had some old hymn or ballad humming under her breath. Drove my pa half crazy, but I loved it. Made the cabin feel alive somehow." "What happened to her?" "Fever took her the winter I turned 12. Wasn't nothing anybody could have done, not without a proper doctor, closer than 3 days' ride, and by the time we could have fetched one, it was already too late." Nathaniel's voice carried old grief, worn soft by years, but never fully healed. "My pa never recovered from losing her. Followed her not 2 years later, grief mostly though, folks called it his heart giving out. I was 14 alone on this mountain, and I've been here ever since." "I'm so sorry," Josephine whispered. "Long time ago," Nathaniel said again, though this time his voice carried less conviction. "But I reckon that's why I understand something about you, Josephine. About carrying grief nobody else can see. About learning to survive alone because there ain't no other choice." Josephine reached across the small distance between them and took his hand the first time she'd initiated such contact since arriving at the cabin. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "Whatever happens with the man in the woods, whatever comes next, you're not facing it alone either." Nathaniel's fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling softly between them as the wind continued its restless search through the trees outside. The tracks appeared again 2 days later, closer this time, close enough that Nathaniel found a discarded tobacco tin near the tree line, still fresh enough that the metal hadn't yet rusted from exposure. "He's getting bolder," Nathaniel said grimly, turning the tin over in his hands. "This close, he's either looking to confirm you're here before he makes a move, or he's waiting for the right moment to catch us unprepared." "What do we do?" Josephine asked, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "We don't wait around to find out which," Nathaniel said. "Tomorrow, I'm gonna set out before dawn, see if I can circle around and get eyes on whoever's out there. You'll stay here, doors barred, rifle loaded." "Absolutely not." Josephine's voice was firm, unexpectedly so. "I'm not staying behind while you walk into danger alone." "Josephine!" "No!" She met his eyes with a fierceness that surprised him. "I've spent 2 years running hiding, letting other people's decisions control my fate. I won't do it anymore. If there's danger out there, I face it beside you, not cowering behind locked doors, waiting to hear whether you're alive or dead." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something like pride mixing with his obvious concern. "You're a stubborn woman, Josephine Carter." "I've had to be," Josephine said simply. "It's the only reason I'm still alive." "All right." Nathaniel relented, though clearly against his better judgment. "But you stay close, and you follow my lead. This ain't the time for heroics." "Agreed," Josephine said, though something in her eyes suggested she might not entirely mean it. They set out together before first light, moving carefully through the snow-covered trees, following the tracks Nathaniel had spotted near the tobacco tin. The cold bit sharp through their coats' breath, fogging in the pale dawn air, both of them alert to every sound, every shift in the shadows. "There," Nathaniel whispered after nearly an hour of careful tracking, pointing toward a small hollow beneath an outcropping of rock roughly a quarter mile from the cabin. "Somebody's made camp there. Recent from the look of the ash." They approached cautiously, rifles ready, and found the campsite abandoned, but clearly used within the past day. A cold fire pit, boot prints leading in multiple directions, and discarded near the base of a tree. A folded piece of paper that had fallen from someone's pocket. Nathaniel picked it up carefully, unfolding it with careful fingers. His face went pale as he read. "What is it?" Josephine asked, dread already coiling in her stomach. Nathaniel turned the paper toward her without a word. It was a wanted notice, crude, hand-copied, rather than professionally printed, but unmistakable in its purpose. A description of a woman matching Josephine almost exactly. A name not Josephine Carter, but a name Josephine hadn't heard spoken aloud in 2 years, one that made her knees go weak the moment she saw it written on the page. And beneath the description, a reward. $500. Payable to whoever could confirm her location alive, to a name signed at the bottom of the page. A name Josephine recognized instantly. A name that made bile rise in her throat. "Senator Whitfield," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's still looking. After all this time, he's still looking." $500 is a small fortune, Nathaniel said grimly. Enough to explain why some stranger's willing to spend weeks tracking through mountain wilderness in the dead of winter. Josephine's hands trembled as she stared at the paper, at her own description, reduced to a bounty, at the name she'd spent 2 years trying to forget, staring back at her from crude, damning ink. "He's not just looking for information anymore," she whispered. "He wants me found, confirmed," which means a branch snapped somewhere behind them. Both Nathaniel and Josephine spun toward the sound rifles rising in unison, hearts hammering breath, catching in the frozen morning air as a figure emerged from between the trees. Tall weathered a rifle of his own, already raised and aimed directly at them both. "Well now," the stranger said, his voice cold and flat, his eyes fixed on Josephine with predatory certainty. "Took me near a month of hard traveling, but I do believe I finally found what I was looking for."
Part 3. Lưu ý viết 9.500 đến 9.800 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề. Phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần hài đắt điểm 10/10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lời AI, kể theo ngôi thứ 3, tăng độ kịch tính, không viết lận màn kết thúc, phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mức document mới, 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đặt 10 đến 15 mini climax, mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút. Có một twist lớn sâu sắc, đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang document, không lưu vào tệp text. Yêu cầu viết đủ 9.500 đến 9.800 từ cho tạo. Show more orchestrated, dense, climactic confrontation. Void twist dialogue và mini climax liên tục. Orchestrated, dense, climactic confrontation. Void twist dialogue và mini climax liên tục. The stranger's rifle didn't waver. Neither did Nathaniel's. Name's Garrett Voss. The man said, his eyes flicking between Josephine and Nathaniel, with the patient calculation of someone who'd done this kind of work before many times and never once lost. "I ain't here to hurt nobody if I can help it. Just here to collect what I'm owed. She ain't a debt to be collected." Nathaniel said, his voice low and hard, his rifle steady despite the cold burning through his gloves. "You'd best turn around and ride back the way you came." "Can't do that." Voss's eyes settled on Josephine, studying her the way a man studies livestock at auction, assessing, cataloging, confirming. $500 is $500, mister. Ain't nothing personal in it." "There's a rifle pointed at your chest that might disagree," Nathaniel said. "There's one pointed at yours too," Voss said mildly. "Reckon we're at something of an impasse." Josephine's heart hammered so hard, she was certain both men could hear it. 2 years of running. 2 years of watching every shadow, every stranger's face for signs of recognition. And here it was, finally the moment she'd dreaded arriving in the frozen quiet of a mountain forest, with a man's rifle leveled at the only person who'd ever made her believe she deserved safety. "You don't have to do this," Josephine said, her voice trembling but audible. "Whatever Senator Whitfield is paying you, it isn't worth your life. Nathaniel won't let you take me without a fight. And I promise you, Mr. Voss, that fight will cost you far more than $500. Something flickered across Voss's weathered face. Not quite doubt, but close to it. "You always this mouthy for a woman staring down a rifle. I've had worse things pointed at me than a gun," Josephine said. "A courtroom full of men who'd already decided my guilt before I said a single word in my defense. That was worse." Voss's eyes narrowed slightly. "You admit to it then. Killin' the senator's boy." "I admit to saving him." Josephine snapped, something fierce breaking through the fear in her voice. "I corrected a surgeon's error while he sat there drunk and shaking, and that boy lived through the surgery because of what I did. He died 3 days later from a fever that had nothing to do with my actions and everything to do with an infected wound that no one, not me, not Dr. Ashford, not God himself, could have prevented." "That ain't what the paper says," Voss replied, though his rifle had drifted almost imperceptibly a few degrees lower.
The paper says what a powerful man needed it to say to protect his own grief and his own pride. Josephine said, "Tell me something, Mr. Voss. Did anyone ever actually explain to you what happened in that operating room? Or did you simply read a wanted notice and decide $500 was worth more than the truth?" The question landed harder than Josephine expected. Voss's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, something like uncertainty passed behind his eyes. "Don't matter to me either way," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "I collect what I'm sent to collect. Ain't my business to judge the why of it." "Might ought to start making it your business," Nathaniel said. "Man who don't ask why he's hunting another human being is a man who's already lost something important about himself." Voss's grip on his rifle shifted, and for a heartbeat, Josephine thought he might actually lower it. Then a second voice cut through the frozen morning air. "Voss, what in the hell are you waiting on?" All three of them turned toward the sound. A second man emerged from the tree line behind Voss, younger, leaner, with the kind of nervous energy that made men dangerous in a fight because they couldn't be predicted. He carried a rifle of his own, already raised, already aimed. "This is taking too long," the younger man said. "Grab her and let's go before this fella's fool notions get somebody killed." "Shut it, Denny," Voss said without turning. "I'm handling this." "Don't look handled to me," Denny said. And there was something in his voice, impatience, greed, the particular recklessness of a young man who wanted his share of $500 badly enough to stop thinking clearly, that made Josephine's stomach drop with dread. "Denny," Voss said again, warning clear in his tone. "Lower the damn rifle." But Denny didn't lower it. Instead, his finger tightened on the trigger, and the forest exploded with sound. The shot went wide, but only barely splintering bark off the tree beside Nathaniel's head, close enough that he felt the sting of wood fragments against his cheek. Everything happened at once after that. Nathaniel returned fire on instinct, his shot catching Denny in the shoulder and spinning him backward into the snow with a scream of pain and shock. Voss swung his rifle toward Nathaniel and Josephine without thinking, without any conscious decision beyond pure animal terror, for the man beside her raised her own rifle and fired. Her shot caught Voss high in the arm, tearing through muscle just below the shoulder, and his rifle discharged into the ground as he stumbled backward with a roar of pain. "Josephine, down!" Nathaniel shouted, grabbing her and pulling her behind the thick trunk of a pine as Voss, wounded but far from finished, fired a wild shot in their general direction. "Denny, get up!" Voss bellowed, clutching his bleeding arm. "Get up, damn you, we're losing this!" But Denny wasn't getting up. He lay in the snow, blood spreading dark and fast beneath him, his face gone pale with shock, his breathing already turning shallow and ragged. Josephine's medical instincts, buried for 2 years beneath fear and hiding, surged to the surface with sudden, overwhelming clarity. "He's bleeding out," she said urgently, gripping Nathaniel's arm. "Nathaniel, if that shoulder wound hit the artery, he's got minutes, not hours." "Josephine, he just tried to kill us." "I know what he tried to do." Her voice was firm, steady in a way that surprised even her. "But I didn't spend 6 years learning to save lives just to watch a man bleed out in the snow because he made a foolish, panicked choice. Cover me." Before Nathaniel could argue further, Josephine was moving low fast, using the trees for cover exactly the way Nathaniel had taught her, without either of them realizing it was a lesson at the time. "Josephine." Nathaniel's voice carried raw panic, but he moved with her rifle raised, watching for Voss's next move. Voss, clutching his wounded arm, watched in stunned disbelief as the woman he'd been sent to capture knelt in the bloody snow beside his fallen partner and began working with fast, sure hands to stop the bleeding. "What in God's name are you doing?" Voss demanded, his rifle hanging forgotten at his side. "Saving his life," Josephine said without looking up, pressing hard against the wound with a strip of cloth torn from her own coat. "Which is more than he was prepared to do for me an hour ago. You're helping the man who shot at you. I'm helping a person who's dying," Josephine snapped. "There's a difference, Mr. Voss, between what a man deserves and what a healer is obligated to do. I don't expect you to understand that. I barely understand it myself most days." Denny's eyes fluttered, focusing weakly on Josephine's face.
Why? He gasped through gritted teeth. Why you helping me? Because someone should have shown you kindness a long time before this moment, Josephine said quietly, working fast, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. Maybe if somebody had, you wouldn't be lying in the snow, having made the kind of choice that nearly got everyone here killed. Nathaniel stood guard over them both, rifle trained on Voss, watching the older bounty hunter with wary, calculating eyes. Your friend's about to owe his life to the very woman you came here to drag back east in chains, Nathaniel said. Something to think about while you're standing there bleeding. Voss's face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, anger, confusion, but now settled into something more complicated, something closer to shame. I need you to hold pressure here, Josephine said to Nathaniel, guiding his hand to the wound on Denny's shoulder. Firm, steady, don't let up no matter what. What are you going to do? I need to see if the bullet's still in there, Josephine said, already reaching for the small knife at her belt, the one she'd carried since Boston, the one that had cut through more wounds than either man standing in that snow could imagine. If it's lodged against the bone, we need to get it out before infection sets in. Out here, Nathaniel's voice carried disbelief. In the snow with no proper tools. I don't have the luxury of a proper surgical theater, Nathaniel, Josephine said, already working her fingers probing the wound with a delicacy that seemed impossible given the circumstances. I have what I have, and a man's life depends on me using it well. Voss watched transfixed as Josephine worked on his partner with skill that seemed to belong to a different world entirely than the frozen mountain forest around them. You're the genuine article, Voss said quietly, almost to himself. Ain't you? Everything the wanted notice said about your skill, that part was true at least. The skill was always true, Josephine said, not looking up from her work. It was the crime that was invented. Found it, she said suddenly, her voice sharpening with focus. Bullets lodged just below the collarbone. Nathaniel, I need you to hold him steady. This is going to hurt him considerably. Denny's breathing had grown ragged, his face gray with shock and blood loss, but his eyes remained fixed on Josephine with something like desperate hope. You're gonna be all right, Josephine told him firmly. Do you understand me? You made a foolish, dangerous choice today, but you are not going to die because of it. Not while I have anything to say about it. With careful, practiced movements, Josephine extracted the bullet Denny, crying out in pain despite Nathaniel's steadying grip, and within moments she had the wound packed and bound tight enough to stop the worst of the bleeding. He needs proper care, Josephine said, sitting back on her heels, blood staining her hands and coat. Somewhere warm, somewhere I can keep the wound clean and watch for fever, but he'll live if we get him there soon. Voss stared at her, his own wounded arm, forgotten something in his weathered face shifting entirely. I don't understand you, he said slowly. Man comes here to drag you back east to face a hangin', and you save his partner's life without even thinking twice about it. I don't do it for you, Mr. Voss, Josephine said, rising unsteadily, exhaustion beginning to show through the adrenaline. I do it because I refuse to let what happened to me turn me into someone who lets another human being die when I have the power to prevent it. That's the difference between me and the men who destroyed my reputation. I still believe saving a life matters more than protecting myself. The forest fell into a strange, tense quiet. Denny's ragged breathing, the wind moving through the pines. 3 armed people standing in bloodied snow, none of them entirely certain what happened next. So what now? Voss asked, finally, his voice rough. You gonna shoot me too? Finish what your rifle started. I don't want to shoot anybody, Josephine said tiredly. I never wanted any of this. I wanted to disappear to live quietly, to never again have to explain myself to men who'd already decided my guilt before hearing a single word. She met Voss's eyes steadily. But I won't run anymore either. Not from you, not from Senator Whitfield, not from anyone who thinks I owe them my freedom because a grieving father needed someone to blame. That's a bold stance for a woman staring down 2 armed bounty hunters, Voss said. One of your armed bounty hunters is currently alive because I chose mercy over vengeance.
Josephine replied. I'd say that gives my stance considerably more weight than you're crediting it. Nathaniel, still watching Voss with wary readiness, finally spoke. Here's how this goes, Voss. You and your partner are going to ride back to wherever you came from, and you're going to tell Senator Whitfield that the woman he's been hunting for 2 years ain't the murderer his paper claims. You're going to tell him the truth that she saved a man's life today the same way she tried to save his son's, and that continuing this hunt is going to cost him a lot more than silver. And if he don't listen? Voss asked. Man like Whitfield, he's used to getting what he wants. Then he'll have to come through me to get her, Nathaniel said, his voice carrying an edge that left no room for doubt. And I promise you, Voss, that's a fight he's gonna regret startin'. Voss studied Nathaniel for a long moment, then looked back at Josephine, still kneeling beside his wounded partner, her hands stained with blood she'd shed to save a man who'd tried to hurt her. All right, Voss said, finally lowering his rifle fully for the first time. All right, we'll ride back. I can't promise Whitfield'll listen to reason. Man's grief blind has been for 2 years now, but I'll tell him what I seen here today. Maybe that counts for something. It counts for everything, Josephine said quietly. Getting Denny back to the cabin took the better part of the afternoon. Voss, despite his own wound, helping to half-carry, half-drag his injured partner through the snow, while Nathaniel kept careful watch for any further surprises the mountain might have waiting. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had begun to settle purple and gold across the peaks, and Josephine's hands, though exhausted, hadn't stopped working since the moment they'd arrived. Cleaning Denny's wound properly, now that she had access to boiled water and clean cloth, treating Voss's arm with the same careful precision, despite his earlier intentions toward her. You didn't have to do this, Voss said quietly, watching her work on his own wound after Denny had been settled, sedated with a tincture from Josephine's bag, sleeping fitfully by the fire. Tend to me too, I mean, after everything. I told you, Josephine said, tying off the bandage with practiced efficiency. I don't choose who deserves saving based on how they've treated me. That's not how healing works. That's not how I work. Whitfield's gonna be furious, Voss said, flexing his bandaged arm carefully. 2 years of hunting, and I'm supposed to ride back and tell him I found you and let you go. You're not letting me go, Josephine said. You're choosing truth over blood money. There's a difference, and I think somewhere beneath all that bounty hunter posturing, you actually understand that difference. Voss was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. The senator's boy, he said finally. Everett was his name. I met him once, for all this happened. Good kid from what I recall. Wanted to study law, follow in his pa's footsteps. Josephine's expression softened. I'm sorry. Truly. I tried everything I knew how to try. The infection that took him, it wasn't from anything I did or didn't do. Sometimes the body simply fails, no matter how skilled the hands trying to save it. Whitfield don't believe that, Voss said. Can't believe that. Easier for a grieving father to hate a person than to accept his boy died from bad luck and nature's cruelty. I understand that, Josephine said softly. I understand it better than you might think. Grief makes monsters of reasonable men sometimes. It made Dr. Ashford lie to protect his career. It made a senator turn his rage toward a woman who tried her hardest to save his son. Grief doesn't excuse cruelty, Mr. Voss, but I understand how it breeds it. Nathaniel, who'd been standing near the door, keeping watch, finally spoke. You said Whitfield's grief blind. That true. Man's been chasing this bounty for 2 years, Voss said. Spent thousands of dollars on trackers, informants, men like me and Denny willing to search every corner of this territory. That ain't the behavior of a man looking for justice. That's the behavior of a man who can't move past his own pain without having somebody to blame it on. Then maybe what he needs, Josephine said slowly, an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud, isn't a hanging. Maybe what he needs is the truth finally from someone he can't dismiss as a self-interested liar. What are you thinking? Nathaniel asked, watching her carefully. I'm thinking, Josephine said, that perhaps it's time I stopped running from this and started facing it directly. Write to him myself. Tell him exactly what happened in that operating room. Not to beg for mercy,
but to finally give him the truth he's never actually received buried beneath Dr. Ashford's lies and the hospital board's cowardice.
That's a considerable risk, Nathaniel said carefully. Man spent 2 years hunting you, letting him know exactly where you are inviting more of his men up this mountain.
I know the risk, Josephine said.
But I'm tired, Nathaniel. I'm tired of hiding, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of letting one drunk surgeon's lie control the entire shape of my life. If there's even a chance that the truth could end, this could let me finally live without fear, I have to try.
Voss watched this exchange with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last hour from calculated hostility into something almost like respect.
I'll carry the letter, he said quietly. Personal from me to him. Man trusts my word mostly after 2 years of employment. Might carry more weight coming from someone he already believes.
Why would you do that? Josephine asked. Risk your reputation with him for a woman you were sent to capture. Voss was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on his sleeping partner by the fire. Because I watched you save Denny's life today, when every reason in the world said you should have let him bleed out and been done with it, Voss said finally. Man doesn't forget something like that easy. Whatever you did or didn't do in that operating room 2 years back, I seen enough today to know the wanted notices got you wrong.
Mum. Denny's fever broke sometime past midnight, Josephine keeping careful vigil beside him, despite her own exhaustion, checking his wound every hour, murmuring quiet reassurances whenever he stirred restlessly in his sleep. Nathaniel found her there near dawn, still awake, still watching over the young man who'd nearly gotten them both killed a day earlier. You should sleep, he said quietly, settling beside her. I will, soon. Josephine's eyes remained on Denny's slowly steadying breathing. I keep thinking about what you said, about being alone until I came here, about your mother humming while she worked. What about it? I think I understand now why you took me from that saloon, Josephine said softly. It wasn't only kindness, it was recognition. You saw someone as broken and alone as you'd once been, and you couldn't walk away from that. Nathaniel's hand found hers in the firelight. Maybe. Or maybe I just saw someone worth saving same as you saw in that boy layin' bleedin' in the snow yesterday. Josephine turned to look at him fully, something raw and unguarded in her expression. I've spent 2 years believing I was unlovable, broken beyond repair, that whatever gift I had for healing others had been poisoned by what happened in Boston, that I'd never again be able to trust my own worth. And now I'm not certain what I believe, Josephine admitted. Except that when Voss's rifle was pointed at you, the only thought in my mind was protecting you, whatever the cost. That doesn't feel like brokenness, Nathaniel. That feels like something closer to... She stopped herself, uncertain, afraid of the word waiting on her tongue. Something closer to what? Nathaniel asked gently. Love. Josephine whispered the word, trembling slightly as it left her lips. Though I hardly know how to trust that feeling after everything. Nathaniel's hand tightened around hers. Trust builds slow, he reminded her, echoing his own words from days before. But Josephine, I think I've been feeling the same thing for longer than I've been willing to admit even to myself. Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, fragile and new and terrifying in its honesty. Then Denny stirred, groaning softly, and the moment broke as Josephine's attention snapped immediately back to her patient professional instinct, overriding everything else. Easy, she murmured, checking his bandage. You're safe, you're healing. Denny's eyes fluttered open, focusing weakly on her face. Why? He rasped again the same question from the day before. Why'd you save me? Because that's who I am, Josephine said simply. Whatever anyone else believes about me. 3 days later, with Denny strong enough to travel, and Voss's own wound healing cleanly under Josephine's continued care, the two bounty hunters prepared to leave, carrying with them a letter. Josephine had spent an entire night composing every word chosen with painful precision. The truth of Boston laid bare on the page for a grieving senator who'd spent 2 years hunting the wrong villain. You understand this might not work. Nathaniel said, watching Voss secure the letter carefully inside his coat. Man's grief might not bend to reason even truth as clear as what's written there. I understand, Josephine said, though her voice carried a fragile hope she couldn't quite suppress. But it's the truth finally spoken without fear, without hiding. Whatever happens next, at least I'll have done that much. Voss mounted his horse slowly, favoring his healing arm, and looked down at Josephine with an expression that had transformed entirely from their first meeting in the snow. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think you're the woman that wanted notice to scribes. I think you're something considerably rarer. Somebody who chooses mercy even when the world's given her every reason to choose otherwise. He tipped his hat, an old-fashioned gesture that felt suddenly significant. I'll see this letter delivered myself. Whatever Whitfield decides after reading it that much, I can promise you. Denny, still weak, but steady enough to ride, offered Josephine a final grateful look before following Voss down the mountain trail. Ma'am, he said quietly, thank you. For everything. I won't forget what you did. As their horses disappeared into the tree line, Josephine felt Nathaniel's arm settle around her shoulders, steady and warm against the cold morning air. You did something remarkable, he said quietly. Turning the men who came to capture you into allies instead of enemies. I didn't do it alone, Josephine said, leaning into his warmth without hesitation for the first time since arriving at his cabin. I couldn't have faced any of this without you standing beside me. Reckon that's what partnership means, Nathaniel said. Facing the hard things together, instead of alone. For a long moment, they stood together watching the empty trail where Voss and Denny had disappeared, uncertain what the coming days would bring. Uncertain whether Senator Whitfield's grief would finally bend toward reason or harden further into vengeance. But for the first time in 2 years, Josephine Carter felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her exhaustion and fear. Hope, fragile, uncertain, but real. So, the peace didn't last more than a week. It was Nathaniel who spotted the rider first. Not Voss, not Denny, but a lone figure moving up the mountain trail with the kind of deliberate, unhurried pace that spoke of someone who had traveled a great distance and intended to see their purpose through whatever waited at the end of the journey. Josephine. His voice carried a warning that had her rising immediately from where she'd been mending a torn shirt by the fire. Rider comin', alone from what I can tell, movin' slow, deliberate. Josephine's hand went instinctively to the rifle Nathaniel had given her weeks before, now propped by the door as a permanent fixture of their daily lives. Could be Voss returning, she said, though her voice carried little conviction. Could be. Nathaniel agreed, already reaching for his own rifle. Or could be something considerably more dangerous. Stay back from the window till we know for certain. They watched together as the rider drew closer, the details slowly resolving through the afternoon light. An older man, silver-haired, dressed in clothing far too fine for mountain travel, his posture rigid with the kind of controlled tension that spoke of a man carrying enormous weight. That ain't Voss, Nathaniel said grimly. Nor Denny neither. Josephine's breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned, slow and horrifying. Nathaniel, she whispered, her voice shaking. That's him. That's Senator Whitfield himself. The rider stopped a careful distance from the cabin, dismounting slowly, his eyes fixed on the small structure, with an intensity that made Josephine's blood run cold, despite the fire still burning warm behind her. Miss Carter, the senator called out, his voice carrying clear and sharp across the winter air. I received your letter. I've traveled a very long way to speak with you directly. I mean you no harm. You have my word as a gentleman, but I will not leave these mountains until we've spoken face to face. Nathaniel's hand tightened around his rifle. Could be a trap. Man like that used to get in his way through force. No, Josephine said slowly, studying the senator's posture through the window, noting something in his stance that hadn't been present in the wanted notice's cold official language. Look at him, Nathaniel. That's not the posture of a man planning violence. That's the posture of a man who's spent 2 years carrying grief he doesn't know how to set down. You sure about that? Josephine took a steadying breath, gathering courage she wasn't entirely certain she possessed. I have to be sure. I have to face this directly finally after 2 years of running. She met Nathaniel's eyes. Will you stand with me? Always, Nathaniel said without hesitation. Every step. Together they walked to the cabin door, and Josephine, her heart hammering, but her spine straight, opened it to face the man who had spent 2 years hunting her across half a continent. Senator Whitfield's eyes found Josephine the moment the door swung open, and for a long, breathless second, neither of them moved. He was older than the wanted notice's cold language had suggested, silver hair, deep lines carved into his face by 2 years of grief that had clearly aged him a decade or more. His hands, Josephine noticed, trembled slightly at his sides. Miss Carter, he said again, quieter this time. May I come in? I've ridden a very long way, and what I have to say deserves better than being shouted across a mountain yard. You'll forgive me if I don't extend you the same courtesy you extended my reputation. Josephine said, her voice steadier than she felt. But you may come in. Nathaniel will be standing right beside me the entire time. I'd expect nothing less, Whitfield said, and something in his tone, resigned, almost apologetic, caught Josephine off guard. Inside, the senator removed his hat and stood near the door, seeming suddenly smaller than he had on horseback, diminished by the modest warmth of the cabin around him. I read your letter a dozen times, he said, before anyone else could speak. Perhaps more. I want you to know that. And what did you conclude? Josephine asked, refusing to soften her tone despite the man's obvious distress. I concluded that I have spent 2 years and a considerable fortune hunting a woman who may have tried to save my son's life rather than take it. Whitfield's voice cracked on the last words, and he pressed a hand briefly to his eyes. I concluded that grief makes a man capable of terrible, terrible blindness. Nathaniel, standing protectively at Josephine's side, watched the senator carefully, unwilling to let his guard down despite the apparent sincerity in the older man's voice. Words are easy, Senator, Nathaniel said. 2 years of hunting a woman across half the country, that's not easy to undo with a few sentences spoken in a mountain cabin. I'm aware, Whitfield said quietly. I'm not here expecting forgiveness, Mr. Cole. I'm here because I owe Miss Carter the truth, whatever that truth costs me. Josephine's arms wrapped tighter around herself, an old protective gesture that hadn't fully left her despite weeks of healing. Then tell me why, Senator. Tell me why you needed to believe I killed Everett when the truth was there for anyone willing to look at it honestly. Whitfield's face crumpled at the sound of his son's name, and for a moment, the powerful, wealthy man standing in Nathaniel's cabin looked simply like a father who had lost his child. Because believing Dr. Ashford's version meant I didn't have to face the possibility that my son's death was simply senseless. Whitfield said, his voice breaking. An infection. Bad luck. Nature's cruelty, exactly as you described. That kind of death has no villain, Miss Carter. It offers no target for a father's rage, no way to make sense of losing the only child I had left after his mother passed. He wiped roughly at his eyes. But a villain, a reckless nurse's assistant who exceeded her station and caused his death through arrogance that gave me somewhere to put 2 years of unbearable pain. Could be always solving my. The confession hung heavy in the cabin air, raw and unguarded. And despite everything, Josephine felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first flicker of understanding. I didn't kill your son, she said quietly. I want you to hear that clearly, Senator, without the noise of Dr. Ashford's lies clouding it. I corrected his ligature because his hands were shaking from drink, and if I hadn't, Everett would have died on that table not 3 days later in a hospital bed. I know that now, Whitfield whispered. How? Josephine asked, surprised. My letter alone couldn't have convinced you so completely. What changed? Whitfield reached into his coat and withdrew a folded, worn piece of paper, handing it to Josephine with trembling hands. After your letter arrived, I did something I should have done 2 years ago, he said. I hired an independent investigator to speak with every nurse, every orderly, every person present in that hospital the day of Everett's surgery. Most were too frightened of Dr. Ashford's influence to speak freely. But one, a young nurse named Sarah Doyle, finally agreed to give sworn testimony. Josephine unfolded the paper with shaking hands. her eyes scanning the careful official handwriting. "She corroborates everything," Whitfield said quietly, watching Josephine's face as she read. The smell of whiskey on Dr. Ashford's breath that morning. The shaking hands. Your intervention with the ligature, which she witnessed directly and confirmed, prevented Everett's death during the surgery itself. His voice dropped lower. She also confirmed that Dr. Ashford threatened to have her dismissed, and worse, if she ever spoke the truth publicly. Nathaniel's jaw had tightened throughout this exchange, something dark and dangerous simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "So Ashford's been covering this for 2 years, he said. Threatening witnesses, letting an innocent woman carry the blame for his own recklessness, while collecting his respected surgeon's salary in Boston." "Yes," Whitfield said grimly. "And I intend to see that end, Mr. Cole. Whatever else comes of this visit, I promise you both that." Josephine's hands trembled as she finished reading Sarah Doyle's testimony, 2 years of accumulated grief and fear, finally beginning to crack open into something that felt dangerously close to hope. 2 years, she whispered. 2 years I spent running hiding, believing I would never be able to show my face without shame following me. And this testimony existed the entire time, waiting for someone brave enough to seek it out. "I should have sought it 2 years ago," Whitfield said. "Instead of letting my grief demand a villain, instead of an honest accounting of what happened. That failure is mine. Miss Carter and I will carry the shame of it for the rest of my life." The cabin fell silent, the weight of 2 years of injustice hanging heavy in the air between them. "What happens now?" Josephine finally asked. "You've confirmed the truth. Does that mean the wanted notice?" "Rescinded," Whitfield said immediately. "Effective the moment I return to Boston, I will personally see it withdrawn from every jurisdiction it was ever posted in. I'll issue a public statement clearing your name entirely, and I intend to see Dr. Ashford face the medical board for his conduct. The drinking, the false accusations, the threats against witnesses. He will not continue practicing medicine in the state of Massachusetts, not after what he's done." Josephine's knees felt suddenly weak, and Nathaniel's arm caught her instinctively before she could stumble, steadying her against his side. 2 years, she repeated, tears finally beginning to fall freely down her cheeks. 2 years of hiding, of pretending to be someone else, of believing I would never again be allowed to simply exist without fear. "I cannot give you back those 2 years, Whitfield said quietly. "I know that. No apology, no legal correction can return what my blindness cost you, but I can at the very least ensure you never have to run again." Josephine looked up at him, tears streaming, something fragile and enormous shifting inside her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finally seeking the truth, for finally seeing me as a person rather than a convenient villain. You saved my son's life during that surgery." Whitfield said, his own eyes wet now. "Whatever came after, whatever cruel fate took him from me anyway, I owe you gratitude. I can never properly repay Miss Carter. I am deeply, profoundly sorry it took me 2 years and immense suffering on your part to finally offer it." The senator stayed only that single night, sleeping in the small loft space Nathaniel had rarely used, and by morning he was preparing to depart. His business in the mountains concluded, but his heart, it seemed, considerably lighter than when he'd arrived. "There is one more thing," Whitfield said as Nathaniel helped him saddle his horse in the cold morning air. "I intend to establish a fund, Miss Carter, in Everett's memory. A scholarship, perhaps, or support for medical training for women who show the same gift you clearly possess. I cannot undo what happened, but perhaps I can ensure other women aren't punished so severely for possessing skill that threatens fragile male pride." Josephine, standing beside Nathaniel, felt fresh tears threatening. "That would mean a great deal, Senator, to women like myself who have skill but no path to use it honestly." "Then consider it done," Whitfield said, mounting his horse with the careful movements of a man no longer young. He paused, looking down at both of them. "Mr. Cole, whatever fortune brought this woman into your life, I hope you understand what a rare gift you've been given." "I understand it every single day, Senator," Nathaniel said, his hand finding Josephine's without hesitation. "Better than most men understand anything." As Whitfield's horse disappeared down the mountain trail carrying with it 2 years of accumulated fear and injustice, Josephine turned into Nathaniel's arms, finally allowing herself to weep freely, not from grief, but from the overwhelming unfamiliar sensation of a weight finally lifting from shoulders that had carried it far too long. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "Nathaniel, it's actually over." "Not over," Nathaniel corrected gently, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Just beginnin' is what I'd call it. Beginnin' of a life you get to live without fear, hangin' over every single day." But peace Josephine had learned through hard experience rarely arrived without complication, trailing close behind it. The letter came nearly 3 weeks later, carried up the mountain by Barnaby Hicks himself, who'd made the difficult winter journey specifically to deliver it, his face grim as he handed the envelope to Josephine. "Come by post from Boston," Barnaby said. "Return address is a law office. Thought you'd want it quick given everything that's happened." Josephine's hands trembled as she opened it. Nathaniel standing close behind her, reading over her shoulder as her eyes moved across the formal legal language. "Dr. Ashford's fighting it," she said, slowly, disbelief coloring her voice. "He's disputing Sarah Doyle's testimony, claiming she's lying to protect me, that we conspired together to destroy his reputation." "That's absurd," Nathaniel said. "Man's got his own guilt staring him in the face and he's still trying to twist his way free of it." "There's more," Josephine continued, her voice growing tighter as she read further. "He's hired lawyers, powerful ones. He's claiming that even if his hands were shaking, it doesn't prove intoxication, and that my unauthorized intervention in the surgery remains a punishable offense regardless of the outcome." She looked up at Nathaniel, fear creeping back into her eyes despite weeks of hard-won peace. "He's requesting I return to Boston to testify in person, to face him directly in a formal hearing before the medical board. Will King..." "That's a trap," Nathaniel said immediately. "Man's had 2 years to build influence to gather allies who owe him favors. You walk into that hearing alone, Josephine, and there's no telling what kind of justice you'll actually receive." "I know," Josephine whispered. "But if I don't go, if I don't face this directly, Ashford continues practicing, continues endangering patients with his drinking, and my name remains forever stained by doubt, regardless of what the senator's investigation uncovered." Barnaby, still standing near the door, cleared his throat carefully. "Might be something I could offer if it'd help." Both of them turned toward him surprised. "I got a cousin in Boston," Barnaby said. "Works as a court clerk, sees plenty of these medical board hearings come through. He tells me sometimes public opinion matters near as much as legal argument, especially when there's a senator involved, willing to speak on somebody's behalf." "You're suggesting I need public sympathy," Josephine said slowly, "not just legal truth." "Reckon that's exactly what I'm suggesting," Barnaby said. "Man like Ashford spent years building respectability in that city. Taking him down's gonna require more than one nurse's testimony, however honest. Might need the story told loud enough that the whole city's watching when that hearing happens." Nathaniel's expression shifted, something calculating entering his eyes. "You're talking about newspapers." "I'm talking about truth being harder to bury when everybody's reading about it over their morning coffee," Barnaby said. "Senator Whitfield's already public about withdrawing the wanted notice. Might be worth asking him to help get your story told properly, for Ashford's lawyers managed to bury it in legal technicalities nobody outside a courtroom understands." The decision to travel to Boston wasn't made lightly, nor was it made without considerable fear. On Josephine's part, fear of facing the city that had destroyed her reputation, fear of standing before a medical board that had once dismissed her without a second thought, fear of Dr. Ashford's continued influence and cruelty. "I'm coming with you," Nathaniel said, the night before they were set to depart, watching Josephine pack the small bag she'd carried from the saloon 2 months earlier, now considerably fuller with the life she'd built since. "Ain't no discussion needed on that point. Nathaniel, this could take weeks. Your trap lines, the cabin, everything you've built here. We'll still be here when we return, Nathaniel said firmly. Josephine, I didn't win you at a poker table just to let you walk into a hostile city alone to face down a man who's already tried once to destroy you. Whatever happens in that hearing, you're not facing it without me standing beside you. Josephine's hands stilled over her bag emotion, overwhelming her for a moment. I don't deserve someone like you, she whispered. That's exactly backward, Nathaniel said, crossing to her, taking her face gently in his rough, weathered hands. I don't deserve someone like you. Woman who saved a bounty hunter's life after he tried to capture her. Woman who chose truth over hiding even knowing the risk. Josephine, you've taught me more about courage in 2 months than I learned in 35 years of surviving alone on this mountain. Their eyes held for a long moment, something deep and unspoken passing between them. Marry me, Nathaniel said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise even himself as they left his mouth. Josephine's breath caught entirely. Nathaniel, I know it's sudden, he continued quickly, his usual careful composure cracking slightly under the weight of emotion. I know we've only known each other 2 months, and I know you got a hearing waitin' in Boston that's gonna demand every ounce of your strength. But Josephine, I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of wanting to spend whatever years I got left standing beside you. You want to marry me? Josephine repeated, tears filling her eyes. Before we even know how the hearing will end, before you know if I'll return with my reputation restored or further destroyed. Wouldn't matter to me either way, Nathaniel said simply. I ain't fallen in love with your reputation, Josephine. I'm fallen in love with you. The woman who sets broken bones with steady hands. The woman who chose mercy for a man who tried to kill her. The woman who's brave enough to walk into a hostile city to face down injustice even when running would be easier. Josephine's tears fell freely now. Joy and fear and overwhelming love tangling together in a way she'd never experienced before, not once in her entire difficult life. Yes, she whispered. Nathaniel Cole, yes, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed was soft, careful. Two people who'd both learned through hard experience that gentleness was a gift not to be wasted, but beneath the tenderness, Josephine felt something fierce and certain settling into place, a foundation strong enough to carry her through whatever waited in Boston. They were married 3 days later by a traveling preacher who happened through Pine Hollow on his circuit route, the ceremony small and simple, witnessed only by Barnaby Hicks and his wife, but no less meaningful for its modesty. Never thought I'd see the day, Barnaby said afterward, shaking Nathaniel's hand with genuine warmth. Man who won a wife at a poker table actually fallen in love proper. World's a strange place sometimes. Strangest thing that ever happened to me. Nathaniel agreed. His eyes finding Josephine across the small gathering, love and pride shining unmistakably on his weathered face. Josephine now. Mrs. Josephine Cole felt the weight of the name settle into her chest with unexpected comfort. A new identity chosen freely, rather than assigned by cruel circumstance, representing a life she'd built through courage, rather than mere survival. They departed for Boston the following week, the journey long and difficult, made harder by winter weather that seemed determined to test their resolve at every turn. But Nathaniel remained steady beside her through every mile, his presence a constant reminder that whatever waited in the city that had once destroyed her, she wouldn't face it alone. Boston felt smaller than Josephine remembered, the same narrow streets, the same imposing hospital buildings, the same oppressive weight of a society that had once decided her worth based on gossip and powerful men's convenience. But she walked through it now with Nathaniel's steady presence at her side, and something in her had changed enough that the old fear, while still present, no longer controlled her entirely. Senator Whitfield had arranged lodging for them near the courthouse, and true to his word, had already begun working with newspapers, sympathetic to justice, to ensure Josephine's story reached the public before the hearing began. The Boston Herald ran the story yesterday. Whitfield told them upon their arrival, gesturing toward a newspaper spread across the table. Sarah Doyle's testimony, my own public statement withdrawing the accusations against you, even a brief account of your work treating settlers in the Western Territories. Public sentiment is shifting rapidly, Mrs. Cole. Josephine picked up the newspaper with trembling hands, reading her own story told honestly for what felt like the first time in 2 years. "They're calling me brave," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "The same city that once called me a murderer is now calling me brave." "Truth has a way of finding its audience eventually," Whitfield said. "Though I won't pretend Dr. Ashford has given up his fight. His lawyers are formidable, and he still has allies within the medical board who owe their positions to his patronage." "Then we face them," Nathaniel said, his hand finding Josephine's beneath the table. "Together, same as we've faced everything else." The hearing began 3 days later in a formal chamber within the hospital's administrative building, the medical board seated in stern judgment along a raised platform. Dr. Ashford himself present with his lawyers, looking older and more haggard than Josephine remembered, though his eyes still carried the same cold calculation she remembered from their final confrontation 2 years earlier. "Miss Carter," he said, using her old name deliberately, a small cruelty meant to unsettle her. "Or should I say, Mrs. Cole, now I understand. How pleasant that you've found someone willing to overlook your reputation." "Dr. Ashford," Josephine replied, evenly refusing to let his provocation land. "I understand you've spent 2 years attempting to destroy the reputation of a woman who saved your patient's life during your own drunken negligence. How pleasant that the truth has finally caught up to you." A murmur ran through the small gathering of observers, and one of the board members, an older woman unusually seated among the otherwise entirely male panel, leaned forward with sharpened interest. "Dr. Ashford," the woman said, her voice carrying clear authority, "perhaps we should proceed directly to the testimony, rather than allowing further theatrics from either party." The hearing that followed stretched across nearly 3 exhausting hours. Sarah Doyle called to testify her account, matching precisely what she'd sworn in her earlier statement, her voice trembling but resolute despite Dr. Ashford's lawyer attempting repeatedly to shake her certainty. "You claim to have smelled alcohol on Dr. Ashford's breath," the lawyer pressed, "yet you waited 2 years to report this observation. Why should this board believe such a convenient late-arriving memory?" "Because I was afraid," Sarah said, her voice cracking but holding steady. "Dr. Ashford threatened my position, my reputation, everything I'd worked for if I ever spoke the truth. I was a coward for 2 years, sir, and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. But I refuse to remain silent any longer, while an innocent woman's name remains destroyed by my own fear." Josephine felt tears threaten at Sarah's words, gratitude and grief tangling together at the cost this young woman had paid for finally choosing courage. When it was Josephine's turn to testify, she stood before the board with Nathaniel's steady presence in the gallery behind her and told her story completely without flinching, without softening the difficult truth of what she'd witnessed and what it had cost her. "I corrected the ligature because a young man's life was bleeding away on that table," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong through the formal chamber. "I did not act to undermine Dr. Ashford's authority. I acted because 6 years of training had taught me to recognize a failing surgical technique, and because I refused to let pride his, or my own cost, a patient his life." "And when he died 3 days later," one board member asked. "From infection unrelated to the surgery itself." "I grieved," Josephine said simply. "I grieved for a young man I had fought to save, and I grieved further when powerful men decided my grief mattered less than protecting a respected surgeon's reputation. I have spent 2 years paying for a crime I did not commit, while the actual negligence, Dr. Ashford's intoxication during a critical surgery, went entirely unpunished." Dr. Ashford's composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulated testimony and public scrutiny. "This is absurd," he snapped, rising from his seat, despite his lawyer's urgent hand on his arm. "I built my entire career on decades of dedicated service. I will not be destroyed by the hysterical claims of a woman who overstepped her station and a frightened nurse seeking attention." "Dr. Ashford," the female board member said sharply, "you will remain seated or you will be removed from these proceedings." Ashford sat, his face flushed with barely controlled rage, but the damage to his composure had already registered clearly with every observer in the chamber. The board's deliberations stretched into the following day, an agonizing weight that tested every ounce of patience Josephine possessed despite Nathaniel's constant steady presence beside her. "Whatever they decide," Nathaniel said, holding her hand tightly as they waited in the hospital's corridor for the board's return, "you've already won something considerable, Josephine. You stood in that room and told your truth without flinching. That takes a courage most people never find in their entire lives." "I couldn't have done it without you," Josephine said softly. "Without knowing you were there believing in me, even when the whole world once decided I wasn't worth believing." When the board finally reconvened, their verdict came swift and unambiguous. "This board finds," the lead physician announced, his voice carrying formal weight through the silent chamber, "that the accusations against Josephine Carter Cole regarding the death of Everett Whitfield are hereby dismissed entirely based on compelling testimony confirming that her intervention during the surgical procedure prevented rather than caused the patient's death during the operation itself." A wave of relief crashed through Josephine, so powerful her knees nearly buckled Nathaniel's steady arm, catching her immediately. "Furthermore," the physician continued, his eyes shifting toward Dr. Ashford with clear disapproval, "this board finds sufficient evidence of professional misconduct on the part of Dr. Harmon Ashford, including intoxication during surgical procedures and intimidation of witnesses, to warrant immediate suspension of his medical license pending further investigation." Dr. Ashford's face went ashen, his lawyer's hand gripping his arm to keep him from rising in protest. "This cannot stand," Ashford said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. 30 years of service destroyed by the lies of Dr. Ashford." The board's lead physician interrupted coldly. "You will have opportunity to appeal through proper legal channels, but this board's initial determination stands. You are hereby suspended from medical practice, effective immediately." As the chamber erupted into murmured conversation, Josephine turned into Nathaniel's arms, tears of overwhelming relief finally breaking free after 2 years of accumulated fear and injustice. "It's over," she whispered, echoing the words she'd spoken weeks earlier in the mountain cabin, though this time carrying the weight of official undeniable vindication. "Nathaniel, it's truly over." "Not over," Nathaniel corrected gently, echoing his own earlier words as well, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Just beginning. Beginning of a life where the whole world finally sees you exactly as I've seen you from the very start." Senator Whitfield approached them as the chamber began to empty, his own eyes wet with a complicated mixture of grief and relief. "Justice finally," he said quietly. "Though it comes far too late to undo the damage already done to your reputation, Mrs. Cole. For that, I remain deeply sorry." "You sought the truth eventually," Josephine said, extending grace she hadn't expected to find within herself. "That matters more than the delay, Senator. Everett would be proud, I think, knowing his death led to justice for someone else, even if it couldn't save him." Whitfield's composure cracked slightly at his son's name, but he nodded, gratitude clear on his weathered face. "I intend to see that scholarship fund established within the month," he said. "In both your names, if you'll permit it, Everett's memory and your courage honored together." "That would mean more than I can properly express," Josephine said, tears threatening again. As they finally left the hospital building, stepping out into the cold Boston air, Josephine paused, looking back at the imposing structure that had once destroyed her life and now finally had restored it. "I never thought I'd stand here again," she said quietly. "Not without fear controlling every step." "You don't have to fear it anymore," Nathaniel said, his arm settling around her shoulders. "Whatever comes next, Josephine, you face it as an exonerated woman, a respected healer, my wife." His voice carried quiet pride. "Ain't nobody gonna look at you again and see anything less than exactly what you are." Josephine leaned into his warmth, watching the Boston streets stretch before them, no longer a place of fear and hiding, but simply a city she'd once called home, now finally fully behind her. "Take me home, Nathaniel," she said softly. "Take me back to the mountains. I'm ready to build the rest of our life there without fear following behind us anymore." "Nothing would make me happier, Mrs. Cole," Nathaniel said, and together they turned away from the hospital, away from 2 years of accumulated injustice toward a future finally, truly their own. The ride back to the mountains felt entirely different from the journey that had first brought Josephine into those peaks 2 months earlier. No longer a woman clutching a stranger's saddle in fear, but a wife settled easy beside her husband, watching the Boston skyline fade behind them without a single backward glance of longing. "You're quiet," Nathaniel said, guiding his horse alongside hers as the trail began its familiar climb toward home. "I'm memorizing this feeling," Josephine said softly. "Freedom. I want to remember exactly what it feels like in case I ever doubt again that it's real." "Won't need to doubt it," Nathaniel said. "I'll remind you every single day if that's what it takes." They reached the cabin 3 days later, snow still deep across the yard, smoke rising from a chimney gone cold in their absence, and Josephine felt something settle deep in her chest. The moment the familiar structure came into view, not merely relief, but something closer to belonging, the recognition of a place that had become, in the truest sense, home. "Welcome back, Mrs. Cole," Nathaniel said, swinging down from his horse and reaching up to help her from the saddle. Though she barely needed the assistance anymore, her strength and confidence grown considerably since that first uncertain ride. "Welcome back," Josephine echoed, and the words carried a weight of promise neither of them fully understood yet, though time would soon reveal exactly how much that mountain cabin would come to mean to more than just the two of them. Word traveled fast through Pine Hollow, as word always did in small mountain towns. The story of Josephine Cole's exoneration, reaching the valley within weeks, carried by travelers passing through by Barnaby Hicks's eager retelling to every customer who entered his store by newspapers that occasionally made their way west, carrying accounts of the Boston hearing. The reception when Josephine and Nathaniel next rode into town for supplies surprised them both. "Mrs. Cole." Barnaby greeted her with unusual formality, coming around the counter to shake her hand directly in gesture he'd never once extended during her earlier whispered about visits. "Heard the news from Boston. Whole town's been talking about it." "I imagine some of that talk isn't kind," Josephine said carefully. Old habits of bracing for cruelty still lingering despite everything that had changed. "Quite the opposite, actually," Barnaby said, and behind him several other customers nodded in agreement. "Folks around here, we don't take kindly to city doctors covering their own mistakes by blaming an innocent woman. And a woman with your kind of medical skill." He shook his head. "Ma'am, we got exactly one doctor in this whole valley, and he's 70 years old, with hands that shake worse than your Dr. Ashford's ever did." Josephine's breath caught. "You're saying, I'm saying this valley could use a healer with your training?" Barnaby said. "If you're willin', ain't nobody here gonna judge you for skill that saves lives, not after what we've heard about what you did for that bounty hunter's partner, and certainly not after what Boston finally admitted about the truth." Josephine looked at Nathaniel, uncertainty and hope warring plainly across her face. "Nathaniel, I already know what you're gonna say," Nathaniel said, a warm smile spreading across his weathered face. "And I already know my answer. This valley needs you, Josephine. Same as I needed you that first night at the poker table, even though I didn't fully understand it yet." The transformation that followed happened gradually. Then, all at once, Josephine beginning modestly treating the occasional injured trapper or feverish child brought to their cabin by desperate families with nowhere else to turn. Her reputation building not through announcement or advertisement, but through the simple, undeniable truth of lives saved and suffering eased. "Mrs. Cole." A young farmer named Thomas Ridley stood at their door one evening, his face pale with fear, his wife's labor having stretched dangerously long, according to the exhausted midwife who'd finally admitted defeat. "Please, I know it's a lot to ask coming out this late, but I don't know where else to turn." Josephine was already reaching for her bag before he finished speaking, Nathaniel close behind her saddling horses for the difficult night ride ahead. "Tell me everything," Josephine said, already moving with the calm, practiced efficiency that had once saved a young senator's son in a very different setting. The birth that followed stretched through most of the night, complications that would have overwhelmed the exhausted midwife, requiring every ounce of Josephine's training and steady hands, a breech position corrected with careful patient work. Bleeding controlled through techniques she'd learned in a Boston hospital that felt in that moment worlds away from the modest farmhouse where she now knelt. When the baby finally arrived, crying loud and healthy, despite the difficult delivery, Thomas Ridley wept openly, gripping Josephine's bloodied hands with overwhelming gratitude. "You saved them both," he said. "My wife, my daughter. You saved them both, ma'am. I don't know how to ever repay you." "You don't owe me repayment," Josephine said gently, exhausted but glowing with the particular satisfaction that came from work she'd once believed she'd never be allowed to practice again. "You owe your daughter a good life. That's payment enough." Word of the Ridley birth spread through the valley faster than any newspaper account ever could have managed, and within months, Josephine Cole had become something the Mountain Valley had never before possessed, a trained, trusted healer, sought out, not despite her past, but because the community had come to understand exactly what that past had cost her, and exactly what courage it had required to finally practice her gift openly again. "You should see your face," Nathaniel said one evening, watching Josephine organize the small collection of medical supplies that had grown considerably since their return from Boston, filling an entire corner of the cabin with carefully labeled herbs, bandages, and instruments. "What about my face?" Josephine asked, glancing up with a raised eyebrow. "You're happy," Nathaniel said simply. "Truly happy in a way I don't think you allowed yourself to be, even during our best moments back before Boston. Something about doing this work, helping these people." "It's not just the work," Josephine said, setting down the jar of dried herbs she'd been sorting. "It's doing it here, with you beside me, without fear controlling every choice I make." She crossed to him, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Nathaniel, I spent so many years believing I would never again be allowed to simply exist as myself. And now you get to be exactly who you were always meant to be," Nathaniel finished softly. "Ain't nothing make me prouder than watching that happen, Josephine." The following spring brought a letter from Senator Whitfield, formal but warm, informing them that the Everett Whitfield Memorial Scholarship for Women Pursuing Medical Training had officially been established, with its first recipient, already selected, a young woman from Philadelphia who'd shown remarkable aptitude for surgical work, despite society's continued reluctance to formally train women in medicine. "He's naming the scholarship's guiding principles after you in part," Josephine said, reading the letter aloud to Nathaniel by their evening fire. "Says here the fund will specifically support women who demonstrate skill despite facing discrimination or professional obstruction. He's citing my case directly as the reason such support is necessary." "Man's trying to build something good out of his grief," Nathaniel observed. "Better use of that pain than what he spent the first 2 years doing with it." He also mentions Dr. Ashford. Josephine continued, her expression shifting slightly. "His license has been permanently revoked following the board's full investigation. Apparently, several other incidents of professional misconduct came to light once people felt safe enough to speak freely." "Reckon justice took its time," Nathaniel said, "but it arrived eventually." "It did," Josephine agreed softly. "Though I find I don't feel triumph over his downfall exactly. Mostly I feel relief that other patients, other nurses won't suffer under his recklessness anymore." "That's because you're a healer through and through," Nathaniel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Even your victories come wrapped in compassion for others." 2 years passed, with the particular swiftness that contentment always seemed to bring, Josephine's practice growing steadily throughout the valley, Nathaniel's trapping business flourishing alongside it, as travelers increasingly sought out both his goods and his wife's medical expertise during their journeys through the mountain pass. The cabin itself had grown too, an additional room built the previous summer, specifically to house Josephine's expanding medical supplies and to provide space for patients who needed to stay overnight during difficult recoveries. "Never thought I'd see this cabin become something like a proper clinic," Nathaniel said one autumn evening, watching Josephine check on a young boy sleeping soundly in the new room, his broken leg set and healing properly after a fall from a barn roof. Never thought I'd have the chance to build one, Josephine said quietly, closing the door softly behind her. Every single day, I remember how close I came to never having this life at all. If Silas had sold me to a crueler man, if you hadn't looked past what everyone else saw at that poker table. Wasn't hard to look past it, Nathaniel said, settling beside her near their own fire. Man just had to actually look instead of listening to what everybody else decided about you without knowing the first thing about who you really were. Josephine leaned into his familiar warmth, 3 years of marriage having deepened, rather than diminished the closeness they'd built during those first uncertain weeks. Do you ever think about that night, the poker game, I mean? How different everything might have gone. Think about it plenty, Nathaniel admitted. Mostly I think about how close I came to not sitting down at that table at all. Almost didn't, you know? Was tired, wanted to head back up the mountain 'fore dark. If Silas hadn't caught me right at that moment, then I'd still be trapped with him. Josephine finished, an old shiver of remembered fear passing through her, despite the years of safety since. Or worse. But you ain't, Nathaniel said firmly, pulling her closer. You're here, safe, respected, doing the work you were always meant to do. And I get to wake up every single morning next to the bravest woman I've ever known. Voss visited that winter, older and more weathered than when they'd last seen him, his bounty hunting days apparently behind him in favor of steadier work, escorting supply wagons through dangerous mountain passes. Heard about your practice, he said, settling by their fire with the easy familiarity of a man who'd earned welcome through hard-proven loyalty. Whole territory's talking about the healer up in the coal cabin. Didn't surprise me one bit given what I witnessed that day in the snow. How's Denny? Josephine asked, genuine warmth in her voice for the young man whose life she'd once saved, despite his attempt to capture her. Doing well, Voss said. Settled down in Cheyenne, if you can believe it. Married a school teacher, working honest as a blacksmith now. Boy learned something important that day in the snow, watching you save his life after he'd tried taking yours. What did he learn? Nathaniel asked. That the wanted notices men print up don't always tell the true story of who somebody actually is, Voss said. Changed his whole outlook on the bounty hunting trade, matter of fact. Told me once he couldn't stomach it anymore, not after seeing firsthand how wrong those papers can be about a person's character. Josephine felt tears threaten at the unexpected news, gratitude for the strange winding path that had led a would-be captor's partner toward a better life. I'm glad, she said softly. Truly glad for both of you. Figured you'd want to know, Voss said. Also figured you'd want to know Senator Whitfield's still speaking your praises all through Boston society. Man's become something of an advocate for women in medicine these past couple years. Credits you directly for opening his eyes. Grief taught him something valuable eventually, Josephine said. Though I wish it hadn't required so much suffering to arrive at that understanding. Most important lessons usually do, Voss said, raising his coffee cup slightly in something like a toast. To hard lessons learned and better lives built from them. It was nearly 4 years after that first poker game when the letter arrived that would test everything Josephine and Nathaniel had built together. Not a threat this time, not danger trailing up the mountain, but something equally significant in its own quiet way. It's from the Boston Women's Medical College, Josephine said, her voice carrying disbelief as she read the formal letterhead. They're asking me to come teach a guest lecture series on emergency surgical technique, specifically drawing on my experience treating trauma in frontier conditions. Nathaniel looked up from the trap he'd been repairing, surprise evident on his face. That's a considerable honor, Josephine. It's also in Boston, she said slowly. The very institution that once would have dismissed my expertise entirely based on my gender alone, now asking me to teach their students directly. How do you feel about that? Nathaniel asked carefully, watching her processes the unexpected invitation. Josephine was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter, memories of that difficult courtroom, of Dr. Ashford's cruel dismissal of 2 years spent running and hiding, all rising unbidden. I feel, she said finally, that perhaps this is exactly the kind of full circle Senator Whitfield's scholarship fund was meant to create. Women learning that skill matters more than gender. that courage matters more than convention. "You want to go," Nathaniel said, not quite a question. "I want to go," Josephine confirmed. "But Nathaniel, this valley needs a healer too. I can't simply abandon my patients here for months at a time, however meaningful the opportunity in Boston might be." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, clearly turning something over in his mind. "What if you didn't have to choose?" "What do you mean?" "What if we found a way to do both?" Nathaniel said. "Split your time, perhaps. Teach for a season in Boston, then return here for the rest of the year to continue your practice. Or—" He paused, something thoughtful crossing his expression. "Or perhaps you train someone here to continue treating minor injuries and illnesses while you're away, saving your own attention for the more complex cases when you return." "You'd be willing to travel to Boston with me?" Josephine asked, surprised. "Leave this mountain even temporarily?" "Josephine, I built my whole life around being alone up here," Nathaniel said. "Until you change that entirely. Reckon I can handle a season in Boston long as it means watching you teach other women to do the kind of healing work that saved my life more times than I can properly count." Benun. They found their solution eventually. A young widow named Charity Simmons herself, once trained as a midwife before her husband's death, had left her struggling to support 3 children alone, agreeing to apprentice under Josephine's guidance, and eventually take on responsibility for minor medical needs throughout the valley during Josephine's periodic absences. "You have good hands," Josephine told her, watching Charity successfully set a broken finger with careful, precise movements during one of their training sessions. "Better instincts than most students I encountered during my own training in Boston. I never thought I'd have opportunity to use what little training I'd received," Charity admitted. "After my husband passed, everyone assumed I'd simply remarry or return to my family back east. Nobody imagined I might build something meaningful here on my own." "That's precisely why women like us need to support each other," Josephine said. "Because too many people assume our only value lies in what men decide we're worth, rather than recognizing what we're capable of building for ourselves." The Valley's acceptance of Charity as Josephine's trained assistant came easier than either woman expected, the community having already grown accustomed to trusting medical expertise, regardless of the practitioner's gender, thanks largely to years of Josephine's steady life-saving work throughout their homes and families. The journey to Boston that autumn carried none of the fear that had accompanied their earlier trip, years before Josephine, traveling now, not as a fugitive facing judgment, but as an invited expert bringing hard-won frontier medical knowledge to eager students in the very city that had once tried to destroy her. The lecture hall, when she first stepped before it, held nearly 40 young women, all watching her with rapt, hungry attention that reminded Josephine painfully of her own earlier ambitions before Dr. Ashford's cruelty had nearly extinguished them entirely. "I want to begin," Josephine said, her voice carrying clear and steady through the formal chamber. "Not with technique, though we'll cover considerable technical ground during our time together. I want to begin with something more important." The students leaned forward, slightly curiosity evident on young, eager faces. "4 years ago," Josephine continued, "I stood accused of a crime I did not commit, my career and reputation destroyed by a surgeon too proud to admit his own failing, and by a medical establishment too comfortable with dismissing women's expertise to properly investigate the truth." A murmur ran through the assembled students, several exchanging glances of recognition. Josephine's story had clearly traveled ahead of her arrival. "I share this not for sympathy," Josephine said, "but because I want each of you to understand something important as you pursue this difficult path. Your skill will sometimes be doubted, dismissed, or actively undermined simply because of your gender. You will encounter men, perhaps even respected colleagues, who cannot accept that a woman might possess technical mastery equal to or exceeding their own." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle across the room. "But I stand before you today, 4 years after nearly losing everything, because I refuse to let that injustice define my worth or extinguish my calling. I built a life and practice in the Western Territories that ultimately proved beyond any reasonable doubt exactly what women in medicine are capable of achieving when given the opportunity to simply practice our craft honestly. The lecture that followed stretched far beyond its scheduled time, students eagerly absorbing techniques Josephine had developed through years of treating frontier injuries with limited resources. Emergency surgical methods, herbal remedies, proven effective through practical application, rather than merely theoretical study approaches to childbirth complications that had saved countless mothers and infants throughout her Mountain Valley practice. "You've given us more than technique today, Mrs. Cole," one student said afterward, approaching with obvious admiration. "You've given us proof that this path is possible despite everything working against us." "That's precisely why I agreed to come," Josephine said warmly. "Because someone needs to prove to each new generation that the obstacles, however daunting, are not insurmountable. That courage and skill, combined with refusal to accept unjust limitation, can build something remarkable, regardless of what powerful men might initially decide about your worth." Senator Whitfield attended her final lecture of the series, sitting quietly in the back of the hall, watching with visible pride as Josephine commanded the room with confidence that seemed a world away from the frightened woman who'd once faced his hunting party in a snow-covered forest. "You've built something remarkable," he told her afterward as students filed out, still buzzing with excitement from the day's instruction. "I confess, watching you teach today, I find myself deeply moved by how far you've traveled from that difficult day in your mountain cabin." "I couldn't have traveled this far alone," Josephine said, glancing toward where Nathaniel waited near the entrance, having attended every single lecture, despite understanding little of the technical medical content, simply wanting to witness his wife's triumph firsthand. "Nathaniel believed in my worth before I believed in it myself, before I'd even fully understood what had been stolen from me. A rare partnership," Whitfield observed, following her gaze toward Nathaniel's patient, proud figure. "I'm grateful to have witnessed its beginning, however unlikely that beginning might have appeared at the time. Sometimes the most unlikely beginnings create the strongest foundations," Josephine said softly. "I've learned that lesson perhaps better than any other these past 4 years." They returned to the mountains as winter began settling across the peaks. Once more, Josephine already planning her next season's lectures, even as she resumed her daily practice throughout the valley. Charity Simmons, having managed admirably during their absence, several grateful families eager to share stories of successful treatment during Josephine's time away. "You did wonderful work," Josephine told Charity, reviewing the careful notes her apprentice had kept throughout the autumn months. "I couldn't have asked for better care of my patients." "I learned from the best," Charity said, pride evident in her voice. "And Josephine?" She hesitated slightly. "I wanted to ask, might I consider pursuing formal training myself someday? Perhaps even attending lectures similar to what you taught in Boston." "I would be honored to help arrange exactly that," Josephine said warmly, watching another generation of capable, determined women begin building the same kind of life she herself had fought so hard to claim. That evening, settled together by their familiar fire snow beginning to fall softly outside their cabin walls, Nathaniel watched Josephine review her practice notes with the same focused intensity that had first caught his attention years earlier, back when he'd known her only as a frightened woman wagered away at a poker table. "You're smilin'," he observed. "What's got you so pleased this evening?" "I was thinking," Josephine said, setting down her notes, "about everything that's happened since that terrible night in Pine Hollow. How close I came to a life of continued suffering and hiding if fate, or perhaps simply your own stubborn kindness, hadn't intervened." "Wasn't fate," Nathaniel said. "Was choice. Mine to stand up when everybody else laughed. Yours to trust me even a little despite everything you'd suffered before." "Both, perhaps," Josephine said, moving to settle beside him, his arm wrapping familiarly around her shoulders. "Though I've come to believe something important, watching my own students, watching Charity build her own path, watching this entire valley transform how they view women's capabilities." "What's that?" "That the world doesn't change through grand singular moments," Josephine said thoughtfully. "It changes through individual choices A man refusing to see a woman as worthless, despite what society insists. A woman refusing to accept that society's judgment defines her true value. Small stubborn acts of courage and kindness, accumulated over time, eventually building something the world can no longer ignore or dismiss. Nathaniel pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. 4 years of marriage, having only deepened his certainty about the remarkable woman he'd once won, through nothing more than a lucky hand of cards. "Reckon that's exactly what we built here," he said quietly. "Something the world can't ignore no more. Not you, not the women you're trainin', not this whole valley that finally learned to judge people by their actual worth instead of ignorant assumption." Josephine looked up at him, love and gratitude and hard-won peace shining unmistakably in her eyes. "Do you ever regret it?" That night at the poker table, everything that followed the danger, the difficult journey to Boston, all of it. "Not for one single second," Nathaniel said immediately without hesitation. "Josephine, that poker game gave me everything I never knew I was missing. A partner who challenges me, who's taught me more about courage and compassion than I ever expected to learn. A life built on something real, instead of the lonely survival I'd resigned myself to before you arrived." Outside, the winter storm continued building strength across the mountain peaks. The same kind of harsh, unforgiving weather that had once threatened to swallow their fragile beginning entirely. But inside their cabin, transformed now into both a loving home and a place of healing for an entire grateful valley. Warmth and safety remained absolute, unshakable, built through years of hard-won trust and unwavering partnership. The woman once discarded at a poker table like worthless property had become something the entire territory now recognized as invaluable, a healer whose skilled hands had saved countless lives, a teacher shaping the next generation of women determined to claim their rightful place in medicine, a wife whose courage and compassion had transformed not only her own fate, but the fates of everyone fortunate enough to cross her path. And Nathaniel Cole, the lonely mountain trapper who'd once believed solitary survival was the safest path through a harsh and unforgiving world, had discovered. Instead, that true strength came not from isolation, but from standing steadfast beside someone brave enough to fight for her own worth and loving her fiercely enough to fight alongside her through every danger and challenge that world could possibly throw against them both. Their story, which had begun with cruel men laughing at a woman they'd decided was worthless, ended instead as living proof of an unshakable truth that the value of a human soul was never determined by other people's careless judgment, but by the quiet, persistent courage it took to rise above that judgment and build something extraordinary in its place. That was the legacy Josephine and Nathaniel Cole built together in those mountains, not merely a marriage, not merely a medical practice, but an enduring testament to the simple, powerful truth that the people the world too quickly dismisses are often exactly the ones destined to change it forever.